One of the earliest recollections that I have as a small boy is on a summer's evening, you know, the many chimney stacks that stood up round Burnden Park and the smoke drifting out the tops of them. To me, it was quite romantic, you know, a bit unhealthy, but quite romantic. And then on a winter's night, where they had a night shift on in a big mill, when you went and looked through the windows, the hundreds of yards of line shafting all howling round, all like chromium plates.
Fred Dibnah will always be remembered for his passions for steeplejacking and steam, and for his love for the industrial landscape that surrounded him when he was growing up in Bolton in the 1940s.
It appealed to him a great deal, the Bolton of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, really because it was his own territory, it was something that he was familiar with.
See the boilers?
Perhaps if he could have turned back the clock, he would have lived in those times, maybe in the 30s or 40s, and been something like an engine driver in a weaving mill, spinning mill, something like that. But it was at the very root of Fred that was ingrained into him and part of his psyche and who he felt he was.
As Fred was growing up, Britain was still the most urbanised and industrialised nation in the world, accounting for a quarter of world trade in manufacturing. It's an era that is almost forgotten, but Fred reminded us of it.
As a small boy, I was always over-inquisitive, you know, like climbing over fences and getting in places where you shouldn't really be. And I used to discover all sorts of things, you know, quite close by to where I lived, a beautiful water wheel with a tree growing through it, but they still had a steam engine, you know, so like the steam engines and the water wheels for a brief period worked side by side, you know.
Fred had wandered around the streets, I'm sure, and wandered into boiler houses and engine houses. And he'd talk for hours and listen, particularly. He had a gift of listening as well as talking and gaining friendships and acquaintanceships, particularly with old men, old knowledgeable men.
With his younger brother Graham, he'd go to play down by the old mill lodges.
We used to go fishing, and our kid and his mate, they were forever making rafts. And, you know, sailing on these rafts like, and on lodges, and we had really good times. And they used to make, in the old factory at the bottom, we used to make a lot of, like, dens, and what we used to go and sit in, like, and have a quick cig and whatever. But when it come time for demolishing the chimneys, he sat there on the bank of these lodges all day, from getting up at morning till they finished at 5 o'clock. And he used to watch them all the time, knocking them down these chimneys. And he used to come home and he said to me, Mother, like, I won't be a steeplejack, I won't be a steeplejack. My mother said, you're joking. She says, you must be mad. Anyway, all the worst to us, that's what he was doing.
In the 60 years since then, our urban and industrial landscape has changed dramatically, as whole industries have disappeared. But Fred's memories stayed with him and became the biggest influence on his life and work.
I remember as a lad of about 16 or 17, rather full of fear, climbing up the engine house steps and looking at the thing going round through the window and seeing the engine minder in an easy chair snoozing, you know, but he wouldn't really be asleep. He'd be listening for any strange change in the pattern of noise that were coming from the thing, which of course denoted something was going wrong if a different noise started appearing. Steam comes through this big red pipe into the high pressure cylinder. Well, when it's been dealt with in there, it goes through another pipe underneath the bottom of the engine and back into the low pressure cylinder. Well, when it's been finished with in there, it goes into the condenser where it's turned back into water again. And this is the piston rod that pushes the crosshead, that's this bit that we can hardly keep up with, that works the connecting rod that turns round the big end, which this is the big end. A lot bigger than the big end in your motor car.
Oh, he grew up with fantastic machinery that he could look at, and he could also see all the mills, all the mill chimneys. It must have been, for him, it must have been absolutely fantastic to have been growing up with the industry that was here. We had engineering works and we had all the cotton mills.
Yeah, well, it's quite dangerous, really.
It is, yeah.
You get trapped in between.
Yeah, you're piecing up like...
Yeah.
We piece his ends up like this.
Yeah. And you've got to be somewhat of an expert nut tire as well.
Oh.
Yeah. Do they often break? Like,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
If it's spinning bad, they're breaking
Yeah.
down all the time.
Ah, yeah.
And that's what you've got to do.
Yeah.
On here with piecework,
Yeah.
you've got to keep them going.
Yeah, yeah.
And we used to get his wage in one wage packet. And then we used to share it on a Thursday.
Yeah, yeah. What, with all the ones who cleaned all the, between all the spinners?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What they call
Yeah.
piecers.
Yeah.
They were like
little pieces.
That's
yeah.
right. They were like apprentices, if you
Yeah.
will.
Yeah.
But when it's coming out, it's spinning.
Yeah.
It's putting twisting.
Yeah.
It's coming off
Yeah.
this top.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And you'll see it,
Yeah.
the whole lot will
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah.
Now, we
Yeah.
go that way.
Yeah.
And then it's
Winding on
right,
top
that's
of it.
right.
Yeah.
Oh, they're brilliant.
Very clever, eh? Yeah, they didn't know what they were doing then, men, did they, when they did this? They used to say, didn't they, in the olden days, England's bread hangs on Lancashire's thread.
Yeah.
And they spun it up before breakfast to do all of England. The rest of the day were for the Empire.
Fred's passion for the history of the places he showed us on the television actually really raised public interest and made people want to go and visit. There's so much of our industrial history around us, and it's part of what makes us what we are, or what made Britain what it is today. That is something we should be interested in, and Fred had a talent for making that really interesting for people.
This is Burnley and this is Queen Street Mill. They were very famous for weaving, and this is a great weaving shed. And if you really want to get the feel of what it's like in a steam-driven weaving shed, this, without a doubt, is the place to come.
It was all hustle and bustle. All cotton mills were going, engineering works, gas works. Very busy. You know, you went out work in the morning, got to the bus stop and two buses would go past, full. You had no chance of getting on them. Of course, there weren't as many cars about then. A time when you could knock on any door and get a job, and they'd say, "Can you start now?"
In the morning, going to work in the morning at 50s, I started at 53. And everybody had clogs on, and clump on bus at 6 o'clock in the morning, 5:45, got 6 o'clock bus from Wigan. And walking down Scoldborough, you must have woke everybody up, 50, 60 men all walking down with clogs on. Even girls go to work same in mills, you know, because they started at 6. It was like middle of the day, especially at Market Square where all buses were. There were hundreds of people knocking about. Not like now, you go now at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's nobody there. They're all still in bed.
There's a super tale that comes to my mind that one day I was mending a chimney and the engineer at the mill, this particular engine were in a weaving shed similar to this. And you've heard how these gears roar and all that. Well, if you can imagine, they've repaired the engine and it's the middle of the night and they set the engine on just to see if everything works all right. And all of a sudden, all the operatives appeared, or most of them who hadn't got an alarm clock. Their lives were totally ruled by the noise of the gearing and the engine. You know, when the engine started, they thought it was 7 o'clock. And in actual fact, it was 3 o'clock in the bloody morning, you know. They all appeared ready for work at 3 o'clock in the morning. In an electrically driven weaving shed, you know, there's only the electric motors and the looms making the racket. Here, we've already got tons of racket just from the bevel gears from the main shaft driven by the steam engine, driving all these line shaftings and all the clack of the belts, you know. Should imagine being like 14 years old and arriving here on Monday morning at 7:30 and being frightened to bloody death with it all. I mean, it's unbelievably violent. And of course, there's only 2 looms actually working at this moment in time. When all these machines were running, the decimals must have been unbelievable. God knows, you know, no wonder they were all deaf.
To the general public, unless you've been in a mill, you wouldn't really know what was going on, and I think he brought that out, and he brought out the hard work that a lot of these guys and a lot of the ladies had to do.
I don't really think I would ever like to have worked in one of these places, you know. Having actually experienced the noise and of it all, I'm really more interested in the mechanics of it all, you know, the engines and the boilers that made it all go.
I suppose the biggest influence on Fred must have been growing up surrounded by the Industrial Revolution and its products. I mean, there he was as a craftsman with his day job as a steeplejack, and he therefore went into lots of places, saw lots of things when they were just sort of over the top and starting their decline. So, and probably when they were at their most unfashionable, the bad old days, and when it was all going to be swept away and we were all going to be living as a life like in an American film. And Fred, I think, was somebody who could see that world that he was in and those people he was rubbing up against had extraordinary stories to tell. And I think that really has been a very big influence upon him.
Hiya, Brian.
Hello, Fred, you all right?
Stalking up.
Yes.
Yeah, keep that big wheel going round upstairs.
Yes, that's true.
When I were a kid, there were bloody hundreds of these, weren't there? There were 3 down every street, and now there's hardly any left. It's still nice to see one that actually works, you know, like there's not so many left that work, is there?
No.
You know? Yeah, what a lot of people don't realise, do they, is the fact that these things used to blow up with unbelievable regularity at the turn of the century, you know, they until they started with boiler inspecting and all of that.
I wouldn't have bothered them, would they?
No. Well, one of them was so tight, weren't they, the mill owners? They didn't like parting with inspection fees and all of that. You need some more steam.
Well, yes, I think
you better put some coal on.
Well, there you go, that shovel for your luck.
You'll have to excuse me if I miss the fire engine.
I think I'll leave you to it, Fred, and I'll go home for my tea now.
Fred's a very passionate man. Anybody that knows him is overtaken by his enthusiasm. He's not an easy bloke to disagree with, and you just naturally get carried along with his enthusiasm for the subject, for the machines, and you want to see what it is that excites him so much.
That were exciting, weren't it? When I was repairing the chimney on foundries, you know, I always used to stop work and go and watch this performance of dropping the bottom out of the blast furnace, you know. It was always very exciting to me.
Fred was a great enthusiast, and we always enjoyed his visits here because he was so knowledgeable about the great age of industry that we tried to interpret at Ironbridge. And he also lived through a large part of a century when we started off by trying to knock down the Victorian monuments, and he was part of that, knocking down the great chimneys of the mills, and then began to value it. And of course he was very much involved with the loving restoration of the steam machinery, bringing it alive for a wide public. And I think he did have that capacity to get to a lot of people and bring the subject alive for them.
Ironbridge Gorge in Shropshire is probably the most important industrial heritage site in Britain. It's regarded as the place where the Industrial Revolution started.
This is the world's first cast iron bridge. Iron was so important round here that this place was regarded as the beginning or the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't just bridges they made here, you know, they made here in this valley, they made the first wheels, cast iron wheels, the first cast iron plate rails, cooking pots, and even the first locomotive were made here. As you can see, there's one or two blowholes in the castings, you know, they weren't too particular. But really on the whole, you know, the whole thing is beautifully done, all held together with dovetails and cotters and iron wedges. Very few nuts and bolts, you know. It's suffered a bit here and there. There's the odd bracing piece that's fractured, and there's been various attempts to rectify it with iron rods and what have you. But the only way I think they could have cast these is actually on the floor of the foundry and directly tap the furnace into the mould. Perhaps that accounts for all the slag and the rough stuff, you know, which normally they would scrape off the top of the molten metal.
Apparently down at these museums at on the Severn and that, they reckon the doors are full up. People can't wait to get in these industrial museums. I'm sure it's because of Fred's made them think and realise that there's a beauty in all this ugliness, if you like. But it wasn't ugly, it's ugly to some people, not to Fred and not to me. It's beautiful.
This thing here, made out of a conglomeration of railway lines and bits and pieces, is the furnace, where they actually got the iron ots ready to put either through the rollers or underneath the hammer. And it's a magical setup really, because the heat that got the iron red hot, the waste heat that went up the flue to the boiler, which that boiler is called a Rastrick boiler, and it actually worked off the waste heat from the furnaces. And what I remember all this lot going in Bolton where I live, and believe me, it was quite an exciting vision watching how it all went. First of all, when the signal were given, the guy crashed these big tongs into the fire, grabbed all of a 200 weight of red hot iron, come out. He got to race off with sparks coming off his clogs this way. Bang! And then the guy waiting here with these tongs, he got hold of the end of it and smashed it into the rollers. And then it went through, and a man on the other side did exactly the same, and it come back this way. As the tail end of the iron came out of here, the guy collared it with these things and slammed it back into the next opening.
He actually knew our ironworks when it was a functioning ironworks in Bolton, and he used to tell us stories about how things actually went on at the ironworks, which some were very surprising, like the fact that there were broken down armchairs quite near the furnaces where people would go and relax.
This lot here is actually the rolling mill that used to be in Bolton, where I come from, and I well remember seeing the thing work as a reasonably young man, and it was quite fantastic. You know, they had easy chairs, and there'd be about 6 of them sat in the easy chairs, and 6 of them shoving the iron into the rollers. And when they'd done so many passes and they were like exhausted, the 6 sat down and jump up and take over, and the other 6 would flop into the easy chairs. Some of them went straight to the pub across the road. Then there's other things about this machine that we've not really dwelled on. In that great iron cage at the end, there's a coupling that's quite a rocky fit on the shafts. And if you put a piece in that weren't hot enough, it busted the coupling instead of the engine or the roll frames. And of course, soon as it went bang, there was a hell of a crack when it broke. Everybody immediately walked off towards the sink, washed their hands and went home, because they knew there'd be no more rolling that day.
this enthusiasm for industrial history really took off after the Second World War, and by the 1980s it had become very much an accepted part of our heritage. But people like Fred have been very important in changing public perceptions and getting a new consensus that the great machine shops, the factories, the commercial buildings of the Victorian age are a very important part of our heritage and should be conserved. And he was a good spokesman for that, I think.
Richard Garrett and Sons of Leiston here in Suffolk were one of the pioneers in heavy engineering. And here in the Long Shop Museum is a grand collection of the products that they made in the actual building that they were made in. This place is rather wonderful and unique because Richard Garrett manufactured portable engines in here, and the boilers came in at one end and the big bits coming from the sides, and the small bits were made upstairs and lowered down. And of course, when the boiler came in at one end and all the bits kept going on, it slowly but surely progressed along and went out the other end as a finished product ready for a coat of paint. That was a long time before Henry Ford were about.
I think Fred's passion was his greatest strength, and it came over in everything he did when he came here, when he went to other attractions. And that brought people into it. They wanted to learn more about it, because if somebody's that enthusiastic, it just spins off onto everybody else. It also increased our awareness and got us visitors. I'm forever getting people contacting me or speaking to me in general and saying, "Oh, saw you on the TV last night with Fred." And that helps us and raises the profile. It's great.
Yeah. So what were them for? Anchor attachments on ships such as the Titanic. Yeah.
This is the Black Country Living Museum, where you can actually see craftsmen doing things what they did when this was one of the centres of industry in England.
Today we've got an awful lot of museums around, and it is sometimes difficult to get people who've worked in the industries that they portrayed to come back again. And I think Fred did quite a lot in raising the sort of image of the worker and their place, and making it okay for people to go back and to look on their past as being important.
How would they go on with the one as big as the Titanic chain, anchor chains? On that you'd have a chain maker, chainsmith, 4 to 5 men, working hammers up to 2-man hammers.
And of course that's really important for museums as well, that we need to get people who've been involved interested in what they've done and realise that it's of great value in heritage and historic terms.
Ladies used to do it, didn't they, a bit? Oh, in this area by the 1920s, there was something like just over 6,000 people in the area making chains, and a third of those being women. Yeah.
The Black Country Living Museum, we think, has a particular role to play in the history of the Black Country, and therefore the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. But telling that story is hugely difficult. It's so complex. There are so many things involved, from steam to canals to buildings. And Fred helped us no end in his own way in putting it over. And through his enthusiasm, he almost convinced us we were doing the right thing. And I'm sure he did that with lots of other people, that he would, if somebody was a volunteer restoring a steam engine or anything else, he could make you feel you're the most important person in the world for doing it. And we owe him a lot.
So you don't fancy it for a living then, Fred? I'll never get paid. Well, you was paid by the weight.
Oh, well, there'd be no chance. I'd be a poor man at the end of the day.
We just do a few improvements on it. Wait a minute.
There's a big hole in it. Another link for the chain for the Titanic. No wonder it sunk.
Fred made industrial history fun, but in the process, we got a lot of information from him.
Up until the 1850s, they only had really cast iron, and they really needed something a bit tougher. And along came Henry Bessemer in 1855, and he invented this thing, like a giant egg cup. And basically, what it does is, the molten cast iron is poured into the top of it, and then wind pressure at 25 pounds per square inch is blasted through the molten cast iron, which takes all the impurities out of it. And when they run it off from here into ingots, it can be put underneath the steam hammer and forged into big blocks that can be put through rolling mills and made into things like railway lines and wheels for railway wagons. This is Callum Island Museum here in Sheffield, which Sheffield, as everybody knows, is a world-famous city for steel making, still is, you know. I think I'll go in and have a look round. Like Sheffield's always been associated with quality steel products, you know, especially like this here, Sheffield plate. And of course tools, you know, they made all the best cutting tools in the world, you know, sort of the tools for lathe turning, for surgeons for sawing your legs off and things like that. And really, unless you've tried buying a pair of Taiwanese scissors and comparing them with a pair of scissors made in Sheffield, you don't know you've lived, believe me. I've got a pair of scissors made in Sheffield that I left on top of a wall for 2 years once. And when I finally found them again, they were rusted solid, put a bit of oil on, and they still cut to this day better than the bloody Taiwanese ones do.
The feeling that we should be guilty of our past, our industrial might, our empire, I think is beginning to fade. I know it was politically incorrect for many years, but I feel certainly for people like Fred Dibnah's portrayal of our industrial strength, the characters, the people and the social history behind it, which for good or bad made us the country we are. I think that was a very important contribution. It's no longer, I don't think, something we should be guilty of. You know, we would recognise the weaknesses and strengths of the past, but we don't need necessarily to be ashamed of them. Therefore, the subject need no longer be a taboo one.
Getting nearer.
Fred, of course, he had a great saying, and he says, everything I like in life is either heavy, dirty or dangerous, you know. And that weighed Fred up to a T, really. And I don't know where, I think he thought I were all three.
They're going back to the steam engines of, you know, my sort of childhood. You know, you meet people at steam rallies who, oh, this is a great big engine and this is that. And, you know, they could have only seen some of the engines that were in, you know, in industrial places. Like the one in Sheffield is a magical piece of tattle. I'm really looking forward to this. This has got to be the biggest winding engine left in the world. And it was made about 1905, and it kept on running till 1970s. And I'm now going to do a demonstration of how fast that you can put it in reverse from full speed forward into going backwards. Here we go. Like that. I did. Great interest in the mechanics of the past stems from when I was like our Jack, you know, when I was quite a small boy, going along the canal from Bolton to Bury and seeing the remains of all the old coal mines and cotton mill engine houses, and some of them were actually still working, you know, so it made it even more interesting. That's really why I've created all this lot here in my back garden.
it's sort of a vain attempt to hang on to childhood memories, I suppose.
Fred's garden was unique. It was all assembled from scrap and the cast-offs from old mills and factories. But it was probably the finest working example of a steam-powered engineering workshop in the country. But more than anything, it was Fred's playground, a place where he breathed life back into rusty old machinery and steam engines. And when he went to Buckingham Palace to receive his MBE, he got no doubts about why it had been awarded to him.
I can hardly write, but I can do things, you know. I'm a mechanic. I'm a backstreet mechanic. Aberdeen University gave me an honorary degree in backstreet mechanicking. And now Birmingham University have given me a degree in backstreet mechanicking. So it'll do for me, that, you know.
And now you've been honoured by the Queen.
Oh, yeah, we're an MBA as well, yeah.
All engineers are backstreet mechanics to a greater or lesser extent. Basically, we all like tinkering about. We're a practical profession. I don't think it's anything to be ashamed of to be a backstreet mechanic. In fact, I think it's something to celebrate. I think he's a very good mechanic and an excellent engineer.
You go to so many museums that appear to be dead. Nothing happens, you know. I mean, lots of them try their best and actually do manufacture bits of things. But this lot here, it all works full bore, you know. You can drill a 2.5-inch hole through an iron bar, or you can forge a big lump of iron 2 inches square, or saw a piece of stone in half a foot thick. So I don't think I've done so bad, really, out of the junk that would all have gone into the scrapyards, but for me.
And Fred's machines, of course, he didn't pay a lot for them, if anything, because they were always archaic, not wanted, belt-driven, but it were ideal. It suited his steam engine, which, as you've seen it down in his yard, it drove to every corner of the yard.
Nearly every nut and bolt in all of this place, I know where it come from. Every piece of shafting, and every wheel, and every boiler, and, you know, every spanner nearly. And it sort of grows, because once you've got established, people ring up and say, you want a bucket full of big spanners that are quite obsolete and nobody wants anymore.
Yeah, he had drilling machines, and he built a machine for cutting with a diamond wheel for cutting stone. That were round the back of one of his sheds. Oh, he could do anything, as we know. He was wonderful. With metal, or stone, or wood. Incredible.
Gravestone quality. One of his favourite pastimes was to journey down to a local scrapyard, and he'd be a devil, actually. He'd be rooting round through all kinds of boxes and skips and God knows what else, searching out little bits of brass and copper, little bits of offcuts. And the people who I went with him once or twice, and the people who owned the scrapyard obviously thought a lot of Fred, because they never charged them, and if they did, it with coppers for these odds and sods and bits of leftovers.
You don't want paying, do you?
Do you ever pay
for a fee?
I think the garden was Fred, in essence, who he was. More than the engines, actually, because those things in the garden have been gleaned over many years. And just basically bits of scrap, and then they came into Fred's capable hands, and he breathed life into them again and turned them into something special, which meant a lot to him, of course, with his skills.
I find them hiding in damp, wet corners of disused spinning mills.
And every time we were away from home, I know that Fred was very anxious to get back, because he always had another project on the go. So they meant the world to him, really, and it was like having a new baby in a way. If anybody had come down to the garden and say to Fred, oh, we've got a milling machine or a radial arm drill and it's going to get smashed up, can you rescue it? And Fred had come indoors and moan to me and say something like, well, I've no room for it, but I'm not having it smashed up. So we'd have all these things outside that would accumulate. And certainly before my time, of course, he'd been building up the garden collection for many, many years, hadn't he? Yeah, that's Fred in essence, that garden, who he was.
I think the biggest influence is his love of steam. And his interest in how it can be used to power large-scale machines. I think that's what influenced everything that he did. It would be very easy for him to have powered his workshop with electricity, but he chose to build a great big enormous boiler, great big enormous flywheels, and drive his machines from that. It probably took him something like 3 hours to fire up his workshop, which he could have done with the flick of a switch. So I think steam was the big driver in his life.
I recognised almost straight away there was something unusual about this chap. I had examined many restored old boilers and engines and bits and pieces like that, and when I came to meet Fred, I realised that he was an extremely thorough person. The preparation of the boiler was beautiful, and the repairs he'd carried out were excellent, so I was quite impressed with him straight away. I thought it was quite amazing that from an ordinary garden he'd be able to build this workshop. I was most impressed with all the machine tools he'd assembled there and the structure to drive them, which was made out of telegraph poles. It would bring about many problems with shaft alignment and so on such a kind of a scanty structure, but he made a rigid job of it and it worked perfectly.
I'm very fortunate having all this antique, obsolete machinery that still works very well, you know. I could make most of the parts. I mean, this thing behind me, even though it don't look it, it's almost new, you know. There's only part of the boiler original, the new rims on the wheels and new solid tyres. The cylinder block, which of course is in the other shed, is almost brand new. All new sides and new end covers and new piston rods and new valve rods.
It was quite difficult at times. Fred had come in and he always had some project going, and machinery would be going in the background all day, and we always had a problem with that, or rather I had a problem with that, because I'd be stuck in the office trying to work and make telephone calls, and Fred was just like a small boy outside really playing with his machines. When I first came here, Fred would maybe have 2 or 3 helpers each day, but later on, as time progressed and more work was done on the engine, he amassed a kind of band of helpers who were only too willing to come down every day, to which I referred to as Dad's Army. They were all men of a certain age with flat caps like Fred, and they were of great use. They turned out to be really good friends of Fred's, but difficult really from a wife's point of view, because you're always the odd one out. You're the one that's complaining if there's making too much noise. Like a mother figure in a way, like small boys outside wanted to play with the toys, and they just wanted to carry on regardless.
Fred would approach a project which possibly he'd never had any experience of before and just throw himself into it in a sense. He might be making a part to one of the traction engines, and really he didn't have the special engineering skills. He would dig out an old book and read in general how you went about the job and then make a start, and if he made a mess of it he'd just start again and he just wouldn't give up.
This is like going to be more difficult than you'd think.
Some of the items he made for his traction engine took absolutely ages, and went through various stages of attempts, and disastrous attempts, but got there eventually. I remember I did speak to an engineer once who saw some of the work that Fred had carried out on his latest traction engine, on the boiler, and this man couldn't believe that Fred had actually fashioned this particular part of the boiler by hand.
Pretty level, isn't it?
He just wouldn't believe us,
really?
and Fred told him how he'd achieved the job. And I think he was still sceptical at the end, yet we knew that Fred had actually fashioned this part by hand over a long period. So he was admired as regards the way he would tackle any job and would never think, I've not done it before, so I can't do it.
Go and have a try, because if we overbend it, it'll, you know, it takes a bit of straightening out, yeah.
A backstreet mechanic, yeah. I mean, there's good backstreet mechanics and there's bad backstreet mechanics. I think it's fair, if he called himself that, he was probably playing himself down, because Fred could turn his hands and do it. There's a lot of people that'll talk about it but can't do it. and there's them that don't talk about it but can do it.
And Fred didn't just do it on his own engines.
Really, the only steam engines that you can find today, you know, the ones that have been restored and are running, like in places like this. This is Glencleven, near Carnarvon in North Wales, and it's one of the first attempts at renovating a steam engine I had, really, and I'm quite pleased with the result. Like, really, it's rather strange how I got the job, you know. First of all, I got an inquiry from Mr. Wakeford, who was the architect here on the site. And he said, we've got a chimney in North Wales, you know. I said, where's that? You know, he said, Carnarvon. And I said, how big is it? Thinking it would be something that we could make some money out of. And he said, it's about 60 feet high. And I said, well, it's not really big enough to travel all the way from Bolton to Carnarvon for a chimney 60 feet high. And then he said, but we've got a steam engine as well, you know, which put a different light on the matter. And when I came, like, you couldn't see the chimney for ivy. It was rather reminiscent of a Cornish tin mine job, you know, with all the ivy around. And the man in charge, he said, well, give us a price for taking the ivy off and a price for looking at it and a price for doing it up. And cut a long story short, we did all of that and we got the job of renovating the chimney. And then one day it came on raining and I sent my man for the key for the engine house. And we got in the engine house and looked at it in sort of sorry state. And it had been vandalised and all the brass bits had gone, or I thought they'd gone actually. What must have happened is the vandal must have got disturbed and left it all behind and run, and then somebody else had collected it all up and put it in a box. And I found that next door. But once I'd secured the contract, I took it all back home to Bolton. We took a shaving off here, and I shined the crank up here. Don't really know how I did that now because the state it were in, like corrugated iron.
He was very proud of his skills, the machines that he could run, the parts that he could make, building his steam engines. He made all the parts himself. These are skills that are somewhat undervalued in our society today, and Fred tried to bring them to the fore.
Now making square washers.
He believed that engineering was not about the theory, but about the practical application.
There's nothing wrong with that for a hole in a piece of iron, is there?
He was an absolutely superb man, whether we were working on a lathe, whether we were drilling holes through a pin, through a bolt, whether we tightened bolts up, all the bolts had to go in the right order. Everything had to be painted, but prior to that, they'd be greased, there'd be a nut tightened down, so all the flats on the nut were all equal at the front.
Considering they was mainly self-taught and there wasn't really a workshop machine that Fred couldn't operate, it's unbelievable the skills he had, really. And I know that from people who taught at technical colleges or other engineers who came on site and saw evidence of Fred's work. They were always enthusiastic and full of praise for the level of skill that he showed and the finish that he achieved with items that he'd made. From the pit egg gear, 30-foot high, right down to making his own sort of individual nuts and bolts for the traction engine.
Nearly everything big, like crank throws and all of that, were all either done on a planing machine, which worked very similar to this, or a shaper like this. Like, basically, it's a plane. It's just the tool takes a shaving off the top of, let's say, a forging that would have come from underneath the steam hammer, would have ended up bolted down to this bed, and the tool ridden across it with a lot of force, shavings flying everywhere. I mean, this is only a toy, really.
But in terms of the appreciation of making things out of metal and making things work, he was very good at that. But there are some special skills involved in getting old machines going and putting together the remainder of old machines to try and make them go again. And that was something that he developed a whole range of skills.
Traction engines and locomotives in the Victorian times were nearly always built in sheds like this, but, you know, actually a bit bigger, you know, maybe 8 or 9 times as long, but the machinery, you know, were all very similar to this. And they didn't seem, you know, nothing were impossible. Like nowadays, a man wouldn't be allowed to play about with something like this. He might hurt himself. But they have nothing, you know, very, very inventive
time, the way they lifted things up and got things about, and some of everything they made were much over-engineered and always very big and very heavy. Even as late as 1880s, you know, they still had this type of gear in it. They had big overhead cranes, but if you study the old photographs carefully, you'll see there's lots of chain blocks and little arms sticking out of walls with a feeble little set of chain blocks on to mess about with weights like this.
Well, he was a self-taught mechanical engineer, and I think therefore he connected with a lot of people who've ever tinkered with a car or a motorbike. He also, I think, connected with that interest in craftsmanship and skills. And we find that increasing numbers of people also want to connect with craftsmanship and skills. And I think he was very good at bringing across the enthusiasm and interest for making things work, solving practical problems. And I think that was very much his legacy.
This is a Marshall.
Yeah, it's got the usual Marshall ailments, hasn't it? On them radiuses there. I wonder why. Marshalls always crack there.
Burrells do an all on throat plate, don't they? Fowlers are perfect.
Yeah,
never cracked nothing a Fowler.
No, very good.
Burrell have you seen cracked on the throat plate?
When you think about Fowlers, Leeds, there were more traction engine builders and loco builders in Leeds than any other bloody city in the land, you know, I mean, there's dozens of them, weren't there, you know? Right, early days, before any of our men, you know, like lots of loco builders, you know, built a few for them men up northeast, you know.
All that employment, weren't they?
Yeah. Now there's no left at all, is there, you know?
Nothing.
What do we do now? Shopkeepers.
In his programmes, either Fred knew these people because he was involved with the people. He'd found out people who could flange a plate or rivet something that perhaps Fred couldn't do. And along the way, these companies that were probably once huge, great big companies employing thousands of people have dwindled down to just 1 and 2 now because this sort of work isn't widely used. Everything's gone smaller and to silicon chips and printed circuits and things instead of rivets and nuts and bolts. But Fred found these people and Fred found them interesting, and then the TV found them interesting because people just don't realise that it is all still happening around you.
Yeah, this is the differential wheel off the back end of my tractor, and of course this ring gear here is a brand new one, and all I'm doing is just drilling the bolt holes to bolt it on the centre.
He could communicate. You know, anybody could understand him, and he could put it over in a way so that everybody, he didn't sort of talk down to anybody. He didn't explain things in too much detail, but he could put things across so that everybody could understand them.
All the machinery, you know, in 1870s and 1880-odd, 90s, it'd all be very, very similar to this, apart from the gearing would have been exposed maybe. And of course they all relied on cow's bellies, you know, leather belts. You know, all locomotives and traction engines have all been made by belt-driven machinery. I mean, no fancy CNC tackle, you know. Quite dangerous as well, you know. I should imagine they had the first year of disasters. Now everything's got guards on and you've got to wear goggles and all that like. I think really we're breeding a nation of men who, you know, aren't what they used to be. That's my interpretation of it. You know, they have got health studios, keep in good order, like. And as you see, this is fully automatic. It's doing a grand job. There's only one difference between this and the most modern state-of-the-art thing that we've got now, is the modern one goes a bit faster. The latest bit is the gearing that I've just done. I made the blanks, but I didn't put the teeth on. I've not got a gear cutting machine.
Nearly all the work on his engines was done in this workshop, but there were a few jobs that were too big to be done here. So for these, he went to a local engineering company.
Yeah. You know, when I think that when I got it, you know, all them years ago, the teeth were all like that on every wheel, you know, sort of thing. You can tell how many thousands of miles it must have done. Yeah.
They're really sharp, aren't they?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. They must have lost 3/8 of an inch off each side that's worn away.
Many people just didn't know that. They didn't know that there were forges still operating. They didn't know that rivets were being made, or imperial nuts and bolts, or just all manner of bits and pieces. The fact that there are traditional boiler makers still operating in the country, where steam engines can be repaired to the traditional manner. Fred just showed people what was in that shed on the industrial estate that was making all that noise and racket, and he showed people how we came to be where we are. He showed that engineering was something not to be hidden away and something to be proud of.
I think Fred's a really good role model. One of my personal things about engineering is that we don't market it in the way that we should. We don't market it as a fun profession.
Stay there.
We market it to youngsters as being worthy, an earnest profession, worthwhile. Now, if you're a young rebel of 15, then I don't think you're that interested in worthy and earnest. You're interested in fun and reward. And so I think Fred is always seen as quite a role model because of his natural enthusiasm and the way he talks about engineering things and the toys that he owns.
I think mechanic's not the correct word. He was probably a backstreet engineer, and by that he meant he'd possibly no formal training in engineering, but it was something which he'd picked up and read. And he was very accomplished in a lot of things that he did. He tried no end of things, and on the programmes, if he was offered the chance of having a go, Fred would always have a go. He was, interested in having a play.
He was a lot of a perfectionist, I tell you. You'd put a rivet in, and if it weren't quite right, it was drill it and get it out, and to take some drilling and getting out, I could tell you. You know, if you did something wrong, he wouldn't start shouting and bawling about it. He'd just say, no, that'll not do. And you had to do it again. You know, so you quickly learn only to do it once and do it right.
Getting better.
Oh, yeah, many a time I've seen him, we've put a rivet in. Oh, that's gone a bit wonky, that, he'd say. No, we'll come, do next one, we'll come back to that, you know, and we'd put another one in, oh, that's better. You know, we'd do 3 or 4 more, perhaps, and then he'd come, look at that one, look at it, come around here and look at it from here. Look, it's down a bit, you know, drill it out, he'd say, you know, let's drill it out, you know, and out it would have to come, and we'd put another one in. And that was just because, you know, when you're manipulating your air-operated hammer, if it had gone a little bit one-sided. He'd done it himself, but he wasn't satisfied with it, so out it had to come. Now, nobody else would have done that.
My favourite thing, Fred's contribution to the sort of knowledge of things, was watching him demonstrating in his own workshop at home how you riveted, how you created arches, those sort of things, the practical elements of the Industrial Revolution. To see things come alive that you've only read about. I remember one example was when he was caulking on a boiler years and years ago, but for me, always wondering what this sort of mystical process was. It was great to see somebody doing it in action, and that he was doing it in his back garden, probably something that, with the envy of many, you know, grown-up boys, was something quite special.
There was nothing in between the plates, maybe a coat of red lead or something like that, but just the rivets alone, you know, wouldn't make it waterproof, so all the edges of the seams had all got to be caught with a contraption like this. You know, in shipyards, they all must have been quite deaf and mad with the noise. You can imagine, you know, 500 or 600 blokes in all of a ship all with one of these. We must have been like bedlam and all. But any rivets that weren't quite finished off, you could go around the edges with a caulking hammer and swell the metal up so that, you know, the water didn't come in.
Fred used to compare his work with what he'd seen on something old and interesting. And he had an ability to say to himself, that's not good enough, I can do better than that, and I'm going to do it again. And that is in fact what he did. The boiler on this roll was actually the 3rd boiler. He actually had 2 attempts at making it, which he was not happy with, and the boiler barrel is the 3rd one. So he knew himself he could do better.
And he would ask me things about riveting and about caulking, and the peculiarities of flanging, for example. And this were much used later on by Fred when he did his steam tractor in recent years.
Now then, Fred, right, gum, that's a lovely surprise.
How are you doing?
Just, let me welcome you with this job. That's from Ralph from Aberdeen. Paul, can you just turn your machine off, mate? Have you ever met my old mate, Fred? This is Paul.
I've never met Paul before.
He's our boiler fitter.
Yeah.
He's 50 years of age.
Apprentice.
And he's our apprentice.
Very
He's
good.
the oldest apprentice in Great Britain. He's a good lad.
Are you enjoying it? Your new apprenticeship?
Oh, aye.
Yeah.
Learning all sorts.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Mending things like this. You know, there's not many people get a chance to do it. Not a lot left of this one, is there?
It's not as bad as some of them, but a lot of grooving down here, and we've already started building it up with welds.
Yeah.
About down here and all.
Yeah, they were, weren't they?
Yeah.
He were an observer, so if he had that particular interest, he'd look about him. From a railway bridge through to a riveted structure through to a Lancashire boiler, and with reading about it and studying it for himself, then he had a hands-on approach of experimenting with putting rivets in himself in his yard. He eventually, over the years, developed his own method of carrying out boiler work to absolute superb, 100%. But there's nothing wrong whatsoever with the craftsmanship that Fred had put into his boiler making expertise.
You're going to show me your new boiler in the your new Arga.
Oh, we're going to see that. We're going to have a brew in there, without a doubt. Yeah. You'll like this, Fred.
Yeah.
1882 Lancashire boiler. Yeah. See you later then. Yeah, see you later. Don't look too hard.
Yeah, see, you've done it then. Magic. Yeah. Good replacement for the Arga, that, I think, isn't it?
Well, it's the biggest and most unique kitchen range in Great Britain, undoubtedly. So I'm informed, anyway. Yeah. We took it out of a mill down in Fazeley in Staffordshire. But I was very pleased to get this because it's a Bury made, a Lancashire made, 1882. And it's William Bland, and you know.
I've never heard of them.
No, neither had I.
Only 5 miles down the road,
Yeah.
I mean, I've kept abreast of your activities on it, and you know, lots of people have these wonderful ideas, but they never come to know, do they? But this has, hasn't it?
Oh yeah,
it's complete with repairs and everything, which quite wonderful, eh?
Yeah.
Was the bread good when you've done it?
It's good bread. Talking about bread, want a piece of old bread?
Ah, thank you. Right,
yeah, watch it up, give me your teeth.
More than likely will. Yeah, it looks splendid, doesn't it?
A pot of tea there for you, all, Fred. All right, mate.
Yeah. You put plenty of sugar in.
There's plenty of sugar in. Some would say you're sweet enough, though, you know.
One of my earliest memories of industry as a small boy were actually coming along this very canal when I was about 7 or 8 years old with my father on a bicycle. Now, I've never been able to swim, you know. I used to ride along the edge of this here towpath, or the actual curve on the edge, and it's a wonder I never fell in, you know. And it was a strange place, you know. It's amazing that really it's survived all the, 50 years it's still here. And all. The thing is, it was like a time warp, you know. There were the remains of old colliery workings, wooden pit headgears, and bits of old jib cranes that had all fallen down, and it were all very sad in a way, you know. But it never left my mind, you know. It got me my first interest in industry going in a way.
The Industrial Revolution was a time when Britain invented machines that were to change the world. it was one of the most important periods in our history. But Fred felt it had never really had the attention it deserved.
Fred was very passionate about engineers and machinery from the past. It was a love affair with Fred. I recall when I first came here and Fred showed me all around the garden and explained all about the machines here, all the steam engines, and it was like somebody who was explaining, like a proud father would, about a child, what each little item of machinery consisted of, what it did, how it had been made. A lot of it went over my head because, of course, a lot of it was technical and I couldn't understand what he was saying. But the passion that was there, and I think most people tapped into that passion, was able to communicate that very well.
Through this passion for Britain's industrial past and the machines of a bygone age, Fred reminded us of a time when Britain led the world.
Between 1710 and 1712, Thomas Newcomen invented a brand new type of steam engine, the atmospheric engine, which was designed solely for one purpose, to pump water from deep mine shafts. The first one was installed here in Staffordshire at a colliery, and it proved to be the world's most successful steam engine. And of course it was used near here at Dudley Castle for pumping water out of the many coal mines that were in the area. There's actually very few Newcomen pumping engines left. And here at the Black Country Living Museum, they built a full-size replica with a beautiful engine house. You know, when it's actually in motion, you can like step back in time to 1712. On the end of the beam, of course, you can see the pump rod which disappears down the mine shaft to the pumps in the sump at the bottom. This, of course, forces up the water up the rising main, and then they let it run away wherever they can. You know.
For a long time, never quite understood why, people didn't really appreciate Britain's industrial heritage. And I suppose it started 40 or even 50 years ago, and places like this and Beamish and Ironbridge all began to get an interest in it, but it needed popularising. And one of the things that Fred really did was, of course, bring it to the TV audience, which increased it hugely and got more and more people interested. We've got to be very grateful for all he did there.
Hello, Roger. You all right? Yes, not so bad, thanks, Fred.
Yeah, this is Roger, who's the chief engineer of this wonderful creation. Won't tell me how it works. He's one of the few men who actually knows how it works.
Shall I stop it, Fred, while we're talking? And
yeah. Aye.
There you go.
Is that the brake?
That's it. That's a bit of string and then the all-important nail.
Yeah, you don't seem to turn any taps off, do you, to stop the thing?
We've got a very simple boiler.
Yeah.
When Newcomen conceived of this engine, there was no boiler technology. The only thing there was like a giant kettle from the brewing industry. And that's literally what this is. The original had a copper bottom and a lead top, which occasionally would melt. And the cylinder is mounted directly above that with a valve.
It's quite simple, really, isn't it, how it works?
It is simple, but it's very, very difficult to engine to keep running. Most of the work is in keeping the fire right, because you've got no other controls, you say no valves or anything, so if the fire's wrong, it just stops, and it'll stop very quickly.
Industrial history had got almost a little bit sort of academic in some ways. It had started off with volunteers and then had become a little more professional, a little more academic, and I think Fred's programmes have actually brought the whole thing back more into the public realm and allowed just the normal person to feel they're able to get more involved in industrial history.
Well, Roger is now going to activate the engine, aren't you, Roger?
That's what it's all about.
Yeah, really, in 1712, this was the cutting edge of technology, you know. Before then... Right.
Oh dear.
Shall we carry on? I hope you got that.
Fred had a real talent for raising awareness in the areas that he personally was interested in. Great at telling stories and great at condensing the years of politics and finance and engineering and technology into a digestible story.
A good example of this is the way Fred tells the story of Richard Trevithick and the early development of the steam engine in Cornwall.
Richard Trevithick was a brilliant engineer and inventor, and he never really got true recognition for his contribution to the development of the steam engine. He was a larger-than-life character who sort of was famed for his bare-knuckle fighting, and he had this wonderful ability to solve problems that perplexed better engineers, more well-educated engineers, like a bit like me, sort of semi-illiterate, you know, but yet he had this brilliant touch of solving these unbelievable problems. He made a fortune and lost a fortune. He went off to South America to the silver mines there and came back a sort of broken man, you know. The thing is that after all them important things that he did for the development of the steam engine, you know, he died a pauper and nobody really knows where he's buried.
I think industrial history and the whole understanding of our industrial past is a bit of a Cinderella in historical terms, and people have tended to go for kings and queens and high-flown lives and people in very fancy costumes. But actually, I think Fred helped people to understand that there's something very special, very heroic about the Industrial Revolution and about the lives that it influenced and about the things and the places that it produced.
Trevithick was born at Logan near Camborne, but his family soon moved to this cottage here nearby, and his father was the manager of the Wheel Chance copper mine. He spent his childhood here and went to the village school, but the headmaster's description of him were he's a loafer and inattentive and sort of very slow. He spent his time wandering around looking at the tin mines and the machinery that existed at the time. He amazed his superiors and so-called men of better education by his unbelievable ability for solving mechanical problems without the aid of arithmetic and all that, just by his own intuition, you know.
He felt that he knew more than you did, but not that much more, that he'd just discovered whatever it was 2 minutes before you switched on your television, and he couldn't wait to tell you about it.
Trevithick's use of strong steam meant that you could build an engine that weighed about 10 tons that would do the same work as an engine that weighed 650 tons. All of Trevithick's early engines were designed to run along the road, you know. And here at Camborne, they built a reproduction of the Puffin Devil, which is a quite interesting piece of machinery. And the lads on top here, you know, one of them was going to tell me how it all works and all about it.
So much unlike sort of slick television presenters, which I thought was great. I mean, not many television presenters wear overalls and mean it, if you see what I mean, or cloth caps. They'd wear it because their stylist told them to. But that wasn't the case with Fred at all. You know, he was wearing cloth cap for real, which was fantastic.
Passion and enthusiasm are hugely important in trying to get people involved in their heritage. And I think that Fred did a great deal in this, especially in industrial heritage, which has been an area which, although it's been expanding over the years, has very much been misunderstood by many, many people.
Whilst he was working as the engineer at the wonderfully named Ding Dong mine in Penzance, super name that, isn't it? He developed his first high-pressure engine, which of course led to these great monsters like this one here at Cornish Mines. You know, I mean, this is a super engine, isn't it? Biggest one I've ever seen, you know. The advances Trevithick made in pumping engines and winding engines definitely gave Cornwall an unbelievable prosperity in between about 1800 and 1870. Another great idea that Richard Trevithick came up with was the chimney, of course, which improved the draft on the boilers and eventually became quite common in all industrial areas on the skyline. The engineers and manufacturers of Cornwall started to build their own engines, their own pumping engines, like Allman Brothers of Camborne and Harveys of Ale eventually became world famous in the field of pumping engines. This behind me is the mine at Levant, and it went more than 1,800 feet down and then more than a mile under the Atlantic Ocean towards America. Quite an incredible feat, really. If you look down into this great chasm here, you can see various flights of stone steps coming up the cliffside. And now in the olden days, before the days of steam winders and wire ropes and cages, the miners had to get down the face of the cliff, far down nearer to the sea as they could, and then enter by an adit that met the main shaft going down and then continued the journey for 1,800 feet on ladders with various platforms down the shaft. And then, of course, they've got to go for a mile underneath the ocean before they actually started work, you know. They must have been some special men. This engine there were what were known as the fast winder, and of course it's based on a James Watt beam engine principle, but it was built by Harveys of Ale in 1840, and it wound skips of oil from a shaft 1,800 feet deep in 5 minutes. Right, Dick, are you going to let me have a go?
Yes, certainly.
What's first job? Take the brake off?
Yeah, take a brake off.
Right. How many turns? Wait a minute.
Go on.
Not enough.
That's okay.
And then what?
Give it a bit of steam.
Yeah, about there. Oh, wonderful.
I think Fred's contribution was enormous because his passion and interest wasn't for a single subject or a single machine. It was his passion was for steam engines in their context, whether it was on railways or in factories, it didn't really matter. So I think his programmes had such a wide appeal because it wasn't just looking at one machine after another, it was looking at places and people.
Yeah, of course, up there you can see the great beam rocking up and down. I think it's a bit unusual because the pumping engines have half the beam sticking outside into space. This one's all inside the engine house. It's a bit different. I suppose the one who did the winding would be here all day, you know, he wouldn't like the ocean and the wind blowing on him, would he? Yeah, down below there, that's the condenser, you know, which of course makes the vacuum to make the piston go up and down a lot easier. You know, there's approximately 14 pounds per square inch less pressure, you know, against the steam, you know, that makes it work much more economically. That's why Cornish beam engines are very economical. It'd be a feat of engineering just getting the engineer itself, wouldn't it, on the edge of this great cliff?
Oh, yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
No heavy lifting gear or anything like that.
No.
I think Fred had really quite a big influence in popularising the Industrial Revolution and the history of machinery. I mean, Fred obviously has a passion for machinery, and that, I think, comes over in every programme. And he particularly loved the golden age of engineering, the golden age of mechanical engineering. I mean, in the 1700s and before that, machinery is stuff that people have to work quite hard to make work at all. So it tends to be iron and black and with big pieces of wood in it.
In spite of Newcomen's unbelievable success and its worldwide acclaim for these engines, they had a lot of weak points, you know, like this particular bit here is the injection cock for the condensing the steam inside the cylinder. And of course, what happened was every stroke, the cold water going in cooled off all the cylinder. So part of the next lot of steam had to warm it all up again, you know. You're all right if you have lots of fuel, but, you know, places like Cornwall were, you know, they've got to bring it a long way, you know. I mean, it's reputed that there were one company in Cornwall that actually had owned 1,000 horses to get the coal from the sea, what had come from South Wales, down into where the tin mines were. And of course, reputed to burn as much as 12 tons of coal in a day, you know. So when you took it away from the coal fields, it weren't very efficient at all. And they were also quite dangerous, you know, like the type of boiler that they had were a pretty flimsy affair, you know. Some of them were made of iron plate, some of them were like top part were lead, and of course it's not noted for its great strength, and of course there were frequent explosions, even though they only used very low pressures, you know. I mean, the only pressure they needed were a few pounds, you know, to make the thing work. The other thing, of course, that were wrong with it in a way were it only produced a reciprocating motion, which means up and down, which meant it could only be used really for any great use in pumping coal mine shafts out, getting the water up. What really were needed were a few improvements in it and some form of turning it into a rotary machine, you know, that could drive the new machines in textile mills and ironworks that were springing up all over the place at this period in our history.
By the early 1800s and through to the early 1900s, that's the golden age of mechanical engineering. Those very, very beautiful machines which you can see running and you can just look at them and they are sort of logic expressed in metal. In that golden age of mechanical engineering, Fred really helped to bring that to life for people, I think. Because, of course, the Industrial Revolution really is the only time when this island has been centre stage in terms of world history. This is the time when Britain led the world. It's its big contribution to the world, really.
Reputedly, the man who decided to connect the cylinder up to the crankshaft is Richard Trevithick. And along with a gentleman in Leeds called Matthew Murray, they developed the horizontal type of engine. And there were literally thousands of engines like this made, from little teeny ones 3 foot long to the biggest one on record were made by a company in Bolton called Hick Hargreaves's. And reputedly, the cylinder were 10 feet long. It had 10-foot stroke on it, you know. An incredible machine, you know, and I don't know how many 100 horsepower it were, but it's supposed to be the biggest single-cylinder horizontal steam engine ever made. I've got some drawings of it in a book at home.
You've only got to look at some of the work that Fred did when he's looking at some of the great mill engines or the like, and going almost overboard about them to realise that he appreciated the skill and the quality that went into them, and that comes over and people stop to think about it. And not everything the Victorians did was great or good quality by any means, but he tended to pick the really good things and put over exactly how important it was to get things right.
The horizontal steam engine was much easier to manufacture in all sizes and sort of you didn't have to have a great big tall engine room to keep it in, and so they made hundreds and hundreds of them, you know, everywhere. Really, to build an engine like this, all that you needed were a big lathe, a shaper and a good iron founder, and you could make one in a shed in backyard. I've more or less done it myself once or twice.
Industrial history and industrial archaeology is still a relatively new area. And greatly misunderstood by many people. You see like a load of old angle iron rusting away in a corner, not realising the importance of that. And so through bringing it to television and bringing it to life, Fred has been hugely important in making people, the wider population, understand the importance of our industrial heritage. Britain's industrial heritage is absolutely unique, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. This is where it all started. And we can't go around losing these wonderful buildings and wonderful monuments to that age of utter ingenuity and great expansion. And so Fred has been extremely important in putting that on television and getting people, and therefore getting politicians, the ones who have the power over life and death over these great monuments, to understand what it's all about.
Steam power didn't really cause the Industrial Revolution, but it played a very important part in it. The factory system, of course, were developed from the textile industry. And of course, all this were done a long time before the steam engine became fully developed. Quarry Bank Mill at Style is hidden away behind Manchester Airport, and it is without a doubt one of the very best places where you can see the steam engine and water power working together. The original water wheel was designed and built by Sir William Fairbairn of Manchester, who were very famous for his what they call suspension water wheels, which of course I rather think comes from the fact that they put the first segment in the bottom of the water wheel pit and anchor it to the spokes, and it would be suspended. Move it round one and put another in, move it round one and put another in, and eventually it'd end up round. The thing is that the original one was so far gone, you know, and rotten, they found this one at a place called Pateley Bridge in Yorkshire. And of course they'd obviously done a heck of a lot of work on it. All the plating's all brand new, you know. Some of the spokes are original, I think. They're quite rusty. When this water wheel was first installed, you know, steam engines were quite well developed, but they were a bit unreliable, you know, and of course this thing runs for nothing, you know, and all the trouble with breaking down and bringing coal and all that. It still was a formidable source of power, as you can see with the size of it, you know, and working through these reduction gears behind me, you know, a lot of power there to drive all the machinery in the mill. These things are called looms, they're spinning cloth with. The noise levels are terrific. Can you imagine what it must have been like in a room with 1,500 of these things all going at the same time? But 16 hours a day, you know. You can see why it's all faded away. No wonder they were all dead.
He could be your mate. You'd want to sit in a pub drinking with Fred and listening to his tales. And I think that was one of Fred's best points. You could relate to him. He was a typical working man, and yet he'd got this fascination for the subject that he loved so much, and that really came over. And I think that's how people have become more interested in it.
Even today, the weaving shed takes its power from the water wheel, you know, and this is part of the transmission, this great vertical shaft that comes up through 3 floors up to this level where the weaving shed is. And of course the bevel gears, and then the horizontal shaft, and then the counter shafts, and then the looms proper. Well, these things were always a great source of trouble. The great weight of a vertical shaft, especially in a spinning mill, which nearly always were 4 and 5 stories high, the great problem when they always got hot at the bottom, and of course once it got hot the whole mill had to stop.
He's put engineering history onto a higher plane than it was before, certainly, and there must be many museums around the country that are grateful for it. As to people's understanding of engineering, I think that has also helped. He was so careful to actually show you something and how something operated or how it was built.
Basically, the transmission, you know, from the water wheel comes up the shaft, up the vertical shaft. Then, of course, it's transmitted into these long ones, which are called line shafts. In reality, these are not very long, you know. I mean, some of them in the olden days, when the torque started at one end, the other end didn't move for a bit till they'd actually twisted the shaft. There was such great weight on them, you know. And of course, they started off at the driven end quite thick. And by the time they'd gone the full length of the weaving shed, they kept stepping down a bit in diameter, you know, because of the twisting action. Quite an interesting, there's book upon book about mill shaft fixing and mill writing. That you know, it became quite an art, you know, setting up line shafts. Number one, they've got to be exactly dead straight and level. If they're a bit bent, you know, it creates a lot of trouble. The great problem with water wheels, they were very economical to run and all of that, like, but there were one big problem. In times of drought, the work stopped and everybody had to go home. Steam power was only introduced, really, to help out the water wheel, you know, but forward-thinking mill owners soon realised that it was a better form of power. In 1810, the mill owner, Samuel Gregg, installed this beam engine, not to be the main source of power, but just to help out the water wheel in times of drought and low water. James Watt came up with a magnificent idea. He separated the condensing department from the cylinder, separate unit altogether. What happens in this case is this here is the valve chest, this rectangular shaped iron box. And this is the exhaust pipe. And when the steam's exhausted from the cylinder through the valve chest, it comes down this pipe and it goes into the condenser. And on the other end of the beam, the rod that goes down the well, that's pumping up cold water, and of course that goes through a pipe round the back here and into the condenser and condenses the steam, you see, which of course helps the engine. The engine is not working against 15 pounds per square inch of atmosphere, so it runs a lot sweeter.
It became, the engine didn't just show you what was in front of you, he would actually explain the pistons, the valves, and never was he happier when on the top of a beam engine or something like that, looking down.
Here we can see the beam in all its glory, like this is, of course, is the connecting rod end, which is connected to the crankshaft. This bit here works the water pump that pumps the water, the cold water, for the condenser. And then, of course, James Watt's biggest and best thing, the parallel motion. Watt came up with this wonderful system of levers that does away with the arc that the end of the beam would strike. If you just connected the connecting rod to the end of the beam, at each stroke it would try and bend the connecting rod, which would be terrible for the cylinder and the connecting rod itself. And this is it, the magical system of levers that keeps the piston rod in a straight line and the end, while the end of the beam goes up and down.
Throughout his series, Fred's visited some of the places that are trying to restore our industrial past, and maybe the public didn't realise the work that was going on there. When you look at some of the places Fred visited, even us at this site didn't realise that was happening. He's really brought it home to people that people are trying to restore, and that there are some fascinating, interesting things there for people to see.
The series of programmes that he did on television featured, the machines of the Industrial Revolution, basically, and our empire was based on that Industrial Revolution. We exported engineers to the world, and Fred brought that back into the public eye through the series of programmes he made.
Really, up until the Victorian times, we'd been basically an agricultural nation, and of course a bit of war in trying to, conquer half the world. And then along came the Victorians and the unbelievable engineering abilities that they had, and they all had tons of self-confidence, all these people like Brunel and Stevenson, and no doubt a great deal of faith in what they could do. Some of the things they built were, at the time, bordering on, the limits of, nobody else in all the world had done such great things as what we did at that period in our history.
Fred Dibnah's heroes were the great engineers of the Victorian age. His interest in their work and his belief in the values of hard work and enterprise that drove them on shone through in all that he did.
Isn't Bard Kingdom Brunel my hero, I think today in his honour I shall wear this tall hat while I have a look round his ship. Really, if it had anything to do with engineering on a grand scale, Mr. Brunel were the man to have a go at it.
perhaps every generation has to rediscover its own heroes from the past. And Fred's championing of the great engineers like Stephenson and Brunel is part of helping us to rediscover those heroes. And obviously that's worked. Brunel was voted one of the greatest Britons that ever lived quite recently in a national contest.
Whilst he was constructing the Great Western Railway, he got this grand vision to link New York with Bristol and the Great Western Railway. And this is the second of the 3 ships that he made. The SS Great Britain, which lies here now in the very dock that it was constructed in 1843.
He was able to spend his life among machines, among the buildings of the Victorian age, and he obviously identified very much with that, and that's part of the charm and the attraction, I think.
Here in my garden, I've got this lovely little steam engine which is almost identical to the one on the SS Great Britain. It's a lot smaller, of course, so it'd be easier for me to explain the engine of the SS Great Britain with this thing. Like, when Brunel first envisaged the SS Great Britain, it was going to be propelled by paddles. And of course, if you think about this, if this shaft went transverse across the hull of the ship with a paddle here and a paddle on the other side, it would be a paddle ship engine. But he kept the same engine, I think, and turned it round through 90 degrees. And on the SS Great Britain, this great wheel here ended up as something like 20-odd foot diameter chain wheel with a chain like a bicycle that went down to the bottom and went round another sprocket in the bottom of the hull, hence to the propeller shaft to the stern of the ship. But it is exactly the same. 2 cylinders down in the bowels of the ship, and the crankshaft practically sticking through the deck at the top. You know, it's I've never had it going yet, this one, but I will do someday. It's quite an interesting sort of piece of tackle. I've not turned it round for a day or two. It's a bit stiff, you know.
He read pretty well every book that was available, I think, on I.K. Brunel, who was primarily a civil engineer, of course, and became shipbuilder. But I think the one thing he did, which Fred had no intention of doing, was he worked himself into the ground. I mean, he died at 59, didn't he, due to overwork. But Fred didn't believe in overwork. That's not to say, you know, don't get me wrong, he wasn't lazy in any way. But if the job could be finished next week rather than tomorrow, it would get finished next week. But by Jove, it would be right when it was done.
So, was Fred anything like any of the great Victorian engineers he admired so much?
The other engineers, you know, the more craftsman-like ones, the Stephensons, people like that, I think were much more like Fred, you know, just down-to-earth people who were very knowledgeable in practical things, and it was that skill which then allowed them to become the important people they were.
It's Northumbria you've got to come to discover the early days of the railways. And of course, great men like George Stephenson, who were the pioneers of steam and iron. Here, on the Pockley Wagonway, which is situated in the Beamish Open Air Museum, up here in the northeast, they've recreated what the railways of the period actually looked like. This magnificent shed is a perfect replica of the Timothy Ackworth's engine shed at Shildon in County Durham, long demolished. And of course, Ackworth was the chief mechanical engineer and engine foreman for the world's first passenger carrying railway, the Stockton to Darlington Railway. And it was Ackworth's job to make sure all the locomotives kept going. Visitors to Beamish can have the unbelievable experience of travelling in carriages with no springs behind George Stephenson's reproduction locomotion #1. Hiya, you all right? The engine has 4 wheels, and of course the tender's got 4 wheels as well. The driver, his position when the thing's on the way is up there, stood on the side on a plank, which is rather precarious. You know, he works all the levers on the valve gear that lets the steam into the cylinders. And then down here, of course, the stoker
He's got to do his business with his coal shovel, well, cork actually. And then when he's got it going and a full head of steam, he's quite within his rights to go on this plank on this side, but that's even more early because there's nothing to hang on to. I think we'll have a little trip down the line. Maybe not quite as far as Shildon to Stockton, but nevertheless it'll be quite an experience. Right, my mate, are we ready? Like all early locomotives, it had no brakes, you know, like to stop the thing, the fireman had to actually jump off and pin down the brakes on the coal wagons, you know. Quite an early occupation.
I said to him on a few times, I said, you know, if you had been born 50 years ago, you wouldn't be interested in steam engines, you'd have been interested in horses. Before the days of steam, I said, steam engines, if you'd have been born when you think you would like to have been born, they would have represented modern technology, and I don't think you'd have been interested in modern technology.
On the opening day, George Stephenson actually drove the locomotive, and his two brothers acted as firemen. I mean, it must have been quite exciting, really, when you think about it. I suppose it equivalent to being an airline pilot.
If Fred had been born in the 19th century, he'd have been there chatting with Stephenson about his ideas and thoughts. Stephenson was very much into the latest thing, not just railways, he was into all sorts of different scientific and technological ideas, and I think that would have appealed to Fred. Fred raised the profile of the great engineers in a very accessible way. He took them out of the realms of the history books, he took them away from the dry open university academics in the tweed suits, and he took them and made them alive. You only have to look at a lot of the programmes that he made to see that this man actually knew what he was talking about, as well as, you know, just going around doing the business. He knew about these guys, he knew about their lives, he knew about their achievements.
Everything's got lovely ball joints on it, so, you know, there's no friction really. It'll all go about in its ponderous way without rubbing on each corner of a straight bearing.
And he thought what they were doing was fantastic. He admired their ability to think on their feet, he admired their ability to take risks and do things that they thought were unthinkable. George Stephenson once said, I will do something that is going to astonish the whole world, and I think Fred would have agreed with that wholeheartedly.
This is a replica of the world-famous Stephenson's rocket, and they're going to let me have a go on it. I'm really looking forward to it, I'll tell you. Now then, what are you doing, mate?
I'm really looking forward to this.
Aye.
Yeah.
Well, let's see if we can get the thing underway. Oh, you're off, Fred.
Yeah, everything okay, man. Yeah.
It's quite long-legged, Fred. You can imagine, keep it going. Yeah. And he seemed to like the idea of 4'7" or 47. The wheels are 47 now.
Fred made it much easier to understand. He, how shall we say, was one of us, as it were. He was a man off the street. He was somebody born in Bolton, Lancashire. He had no pretensions of going to college. He was a straightforward, down-to-earth man.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're just going over the crossing.
And he understood things on his level, and he had a great ability to communicate that understanding in a way that the layman, person on the street, person watching his programmes, could just communicate with and just see what he was talking about rather than get tangled up in academia.
Most unbelievable reversing gear I've ever played with.
Steam, Fred. Yeah. We're coming up to the buffers.
To stop it, you're basically banging in reverse.
Don't try it with your Ford Fiesta, Fred. Don't try it with a Ford Fiesta.
No. The world's first successful passenger engine.
Yeah. Imagine what other people would think when they thought, they were saying that your lungs would collapse with such speed and stuff like this.
In fact, one man who actually drove this thing, I've read in an history book somewhere that he got so uptight about it, he asked for it to be taken off the job, you know, it went too fast at 35 miles an hour. Here inside the museum they have a full-size cutaway replica of the rocket, and you can actually see how the features of it, even in the most modern locomotive, steam locomotive, all the main features have never ever altered, you know, like this is the exhaust pipe or the blast pipe, there's one on each side, which makes the locomotive woof woof woof.
When Fred talks about people like Brunel and Stevenson, he's excited by them because they don't just work with their head, they could work with their hands, and they knew how machines operated, they knew what it took to make them run smoothly. He knew that they were excited about the mechanics, the insides of machines.
This engine here behind me is the only long-boilered tender mainline engine in existence, and it's a design that were done by Robert Stevenson in the 1830s. I mean, this were made quite a lot later, you know, but it's the basic shape of it, inside cylinders and 6 wheels, had been around since 1830. When you really look at it and you compare it with the rocket, which were 1829, you know, rapid advances were made in a very short time, you know, to a thing as big as this, from something like Stevenson's rocket, which of course is only half the size of it. Robert Stevenson and his company, of course, didn't just build locomotives, you know, they built the lines and the bridges and all the engineering works involved in the construction of a full-size railway. Newcastle's high-level bridge was designed by Robert Stevenson and opened in 1849 by Queen Victoria. And it's rather an interesting structure, really, when you think. Like, of course, it's basically made of cast iron arches with wrought iron tie rods stiffening it all up, and it stands on 5 sandstone pillars. But the interesting bit is the railway is on the top and the roadway is underneath. And when you think, really, it's a credit to Mr. Stevenson. It's still here today and still functioning quite well. And of course, when you think of the weight of all the stuff that goes over it, railway trains are much heavier now than they were in 1849. Motor cars have replaced horses and carriages, which of course are heavier, and motor wagons, and it's still going strong. It's a credit to him, really.
He was very comfortable with the things the Victorians had made. He liked their technology. He liked the way they expressed themselves. I think he liked their confidence. And I think if you went back to Victorian times, you would have found a lot of people like Fred.
And this is the sort of place they might have worked. Robert Stevenson's locomotive works in Newcastle.
This is the visitor's staircase, where people like Brunel and Daniel Gooch would come when they were doing deals. It leads up to Mr. Stevenson's private office. So there you're near the drawing office. Yeah. This is Mr. Stevenson's personal office. How sad, eh? A bit of Cornish mould left and half a fireplace. And these lovely windows with beautiful narrow sash bars, you know. And even the shutters still work. It's all really good quality joinery in this, you know. And I know, living in a house that were built in 1850s, that all of this is right for that period. You know. Yeah. I do hope they can raise enough money and restore it to its past glory. Next door here, through in this drawing office, you can imagine them all scratching away, drawing 4-wheel locomotives for the world market, as you might say.
Undoubtedly, the great British engineers who built the empire, you know, Fred was not a great man for political correctness, and would talk about the colonies, referring to America and other parts of the world that we, you know, we built the world's railways, if you like, and Fred would talk endlessly about that. And I think they were the sort of people who he really admired. They were his heroes from boyhood days, I would imagine.
This, of course, was the drawing office, you know, where I suppose all the early locomotives of England, most of them were possibly designed here. And of course, all that lot there were all filled in with windows. And then down below the assembly shop, you know, they got to have it locked in because the muck had come up. And I suppose there'd be a constant supply up these stairs of people wanting to know measurements and different dimensions for the bits they were machining downstairs. Down here, this is where the locomotives were actually assembled. You know, I like places like this. You can imagine, you know, in 1836 or something like that, you know, they'd be really going hammer and tongs in here, all the beautiful, shiny brass and copper, you know. Over here, there were a great, big, long, flat belt-driven lathes, and some smaller ones at the end, which possibly were used for doing the finer bits of brackets and bits and pieces. Somewhere very nearby, in a building similar to this, they would have had the foundry, where the wheels, the cylinders, and like small sort of brackets that were nearly always under compression that would be cast. And then, of course, they'd come here to be machined over there against that wall, and then be assembled on the locomotive that were being constructed.
Victorian engineers and men of that ilk, miners, and workers in factories, anybody with any degree of skill, was somebody in Fred's mind that deserved recognition because they didn't mind getting their hands dirty. They suffered, you know, there was great toil in the old days and suffering, and Fred, he had an empathy with that, really.
Here at the Victorian Iron Foundry at Iron Bridge Gorge Museum, you can actually see how they would have cast a locomotive wheel in like the mid-Victorian period. In fact, all the bits of steam locomotive that were made of cast iron, like the funnel, the brake box, the blast pipe, there were a heck of a lot of cast iron in a locomotive. Well, the wheel is the main thing, really. It went very well, that, very smoothly, didn't it? You know, you see how the molten metal ran from the pouring hole and all the way around and then into centre. And then how it sunk in middle, you know, they do that, and got to keep putting a bit on in the middle. Yeah, I think I'd better move on because my trousers are nearly on fire. Bloody hell. Hot that.
It was these people who made Britain great, and I think that was for many years forgotten. There's been this recent revitalisation, the idea that, you know, it's okay to say Britain was industrially mighty. It's not politically incorrect to say that anymore. And I think there was certainly a phase we saw, you know, where we felt guilty about our empire and our aspirations for world domination. You know, people like Brunel, Hackworth, certainly, you know, the Stephensons, we've kind of reinterpreted their importance and their roles. And all of these people contributed to that kind of industrial knowledge that people like Fred would, you know, recreate in their garden.
All right. Right, really, the equipment that they had, or would have had in Robert Stephenson's place up in Newcastle on Tyne, wouldn't have been a great deal different than this, and it would be definitely driven from a line shaft by a steam engine. I mean, even the drills, they'd be almost identical, apart from maybe the gears would be exposed, you know, make even more row than this. I mean, when you think about it, it was a superb job, you know. It's very slow, though, compared with modern equipment. I mean, they'd have used it for, you know, boring all the brackets and bits and pieces for the motion of a locomotive. I mean, they'd have had bigger versions for, you know, drilling holes in ends of cranks and things like that.
Fred's main interest is steam. All the machines that he uses and loves are driven by steam, and steam was the driving medium of the Victorian age. So I think he sees himself as a contemporary of the likes of Stephenson, Hackworth, Brunel in the big steam age. He's raised their awareness tremendously. I mean, he mentions them in all his programmes. They're obviously his heroes of the past, and they would be forgotten if it wasn't for people like Fred, who remind us of the contribution that they made to our industrial heritage.
I think he brought the whole story of Britain's great industrial development to people's awareness, and particularly through some of the famous people involved, the Stephensons, the Hackworths, etc. But it probably too came over that there were a lot of people like him in the Victorian era who, through their graft and through their work, got Britain to be where it was as a leading industrial nation.
And one of them was the great Victorian industrialist, Sir William Armstrong.
William Armstrong really were actually a lawyer. He studied the law, you know, but he had this other interest in science and technology, and of course one of his great things were hydraulics. It's an astonishing fact that Armstrong never had any formal training in engineering, you know. Everything he knew he taught himself. And at the beginning of his company, for the first 15 years, he never had a holiday, you know, a bit like me, really. And of course, like Brunel, he like were dedicated to the job, you know. I mean, if there were a great problem wanted solving, you know, he didn't even go home, you know, he would sleep on the job.
There have been a number of biographies of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who's much the most famous engineer in history, perhaps too famous, some would say. There's been one biography of George and Robert Stephenson and one of Robert Stephenson. There hasn't yet been a proper biography of Sir William Armstrong at all. Their names, which were known to maybe, you know, in the order of 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people. But after Fred's programmes, their names were known to several million people, which is a huge contribution in public education, if you think about it.
By 1847, Armstrong had given up practicing law. He opened his Elsick Works on the banks of the River Tyne, where he manufactured hydraulic cranes and all sorts of other engineering equipment like lathes and steam engines and steam pumps. The business was a huge success and went on to provide engines and hydraulic machinery for some of the greatest civil engineering projects of the Victorian age, including Tower Bridge and the Manchester Ship Canal. By 1867, the Armstrong Company had begun to build iron warships, and in the first 15 years they built 20. And in the last quarter of the last century, you know, they became like world leaders in armaments and warship building. By this time he'd become a lord, and he'd also become a great landowner. And this here is his parlour, you know, very beautiful, and he must have made a lot of money. And here he entertained foreign envoys and princes who'd all come down to have a look at his big guns, you know. And of course, at first he was very patriotic. He only sold them to the British government, but they terminated his contract, and then he threw patriotism through the window and started selling them to everybody all over the world and became the greatest armament supplier of the time.
What Fred grasped is that you don't have to throw out the whole of Victorian culture and deride all of its achievements simply because there are some aspects of it which, perhaps for good reasons, we would find politically incorrect or unpleasant or difficult to deal with now. I mean, I think he grasped that it was one of the most creative cultures that there has ever been, and I think he grasped that that was a unique historical achievement that Victorian Britain produced, and that if there are nasty sides to it along the way, there was appalling poverty in those cities, that actually the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened without them, and it doesn't mean that it wasn't a great achievement.
By the 1890s, the manufacture of arms and battleships had become one of our major industries. Armstrong had turned a brilliantly successful engineering works into a symbol of imperial might. Here at this spot, you know, down there they made all the battleships, and up there kept extending and extending all the way to the Scotswood Works. In fact, in my shed I've got a riveting hammer that says Sir W.G. Armstrong, Scotswood Works, Newcastle on Tyne. So I know they made riveting hammers up there. What an empire it must have been.
I mean, it's lovely to think of the Victorian age as a heroic age. It wasn't always a heroic age for the people involved, and he understood that, made it clear that there was real hardship in sort of running a steam engine sort of perfectly for hour upon hour, or being on the locomotive going up to Scotland, you know, with hardly any protection at all, and having to spot every signal, sort of come rain, come shine. You know, these were very demanding jobs that people had, and I think he understood that.
Fred has a very strong understanding of the traditions of the Victorian Industrial Revolution, and one of the great underpinnings of that was this idea of self-help, that you could, if you worked hard enough, you would be able to achieve anything that you wanted. It wasn't always easy, there were sacrifices to be made, but he knew that a good day's work for a good day's pay was the best way in which you could live your life.
I think Fred's contribution to understanding the great engineers is, in a sense, overshadowed by his ability that he's got people to understand the unknown engineers, you know, the riveters and the blacksmiths and the people who really did it. And there was this sense that, yeah, the Victorians, they saw things going wrong in their world, but they also felt that they were working towards a new era of peace and prosperity, and somehow all the things that were wrong, like slums or illness or whatever, would ultimately be swept away by material advancement. And that sense of optimism, which we've so lost. We now know that imperialism has all these problems, that industrialization brings global warming and pollution. And he was looking back to that world where people, you know, believed in what they were doing passionately and were trying and believed they were making things better.
I think really I'd have been an happy man then, you know, putting all the poverty and you know, awful things that there were in the Victorian period aside. You know, I think if you were a mechanical bent, you could survive then, you know, like, I reckon I'd have been all right. I don't think I'd have been out of work. Magnificent town hall like this one here at Bolton is a grand example of Victorian civic pride. The success and prosperity that the Industrial Revolution brought to towns like this left us with some magnificent buildings. Just look at the fancy work on there. They love to have everything ornate and quite beautiful to look at, you know, pleasing to the eye. The actual ornamentation were almost as important as the building itself. I mean, it definitely was the great age of Victorian splendour.
Fred Dibnah was, by his own admission, a man born out of his time. He always said he should have been born in the Victorian age. It's the age he admired, the time he would like to have lived and worked. His appreciation of the architectural and decorative skills of the age went back to his first job.
I first became interested in buildings, you know, when I was about 15 years old. And of course, I lived here in this small terraced house. This wall is one of the first things I ever built. The thing is, my mother and father wanted me to be an undertaker. Now, I didn't fancy that, you know, so I got on my bicycle and I pedalled off to the Youth Employment Bureau, where they fixed me up with a job as a joiner. My work as a joiner got me into some of the splendid mansions that the cotton mill owners and bleach works owners had built. This actual house was built by a bleach works owner. The thing is, I couldn't help but notice, having come from an house that hadn't got any skirting boards, you know, the quality of the woodwork and the height of the skirting boards, 18 inches up the walls, and the beautiful panel doors and architraves, and best of all, the fancy plastered ceilings, you know. Made me wonder, you know, how ever did they do it, you know. Of course, it's a pub now, so really everybody can enjoy it.
He did have Victorian values. I think the biggest emphasis on what he appreciated about Victorian values was the quality. Everything was made to a very high standard. Most things were made by hand, and that is what he appreciated the most, that everything looked the part and everything was built to last. Everything had a job and it did it for generations.
What you see in here, though, you know, they're really all done just to be looked at, you know. Things like the smallest details, you know, had to be beautiful. I mean, even if it were a great big thing, like a civil engineering piece, they still made a fuss of it, I mean, but in houses, you know, the minute detail, right down to things like window catches, were always quite beautiful.
For Fred, it was these high standards that made Britain lead the world.
Fred was proud to be British, and he was proud of the achievements of Great Britain. And I think that really this country has gone through huge changes, 2 devastating world wars which bankrupted the country, and the loss of empire. There's an awful lot of psychological adjustment necessary to build the new Britain that we all live in now. And I think that maybe people were abashed to talk about those great days when Britain was so confident and really was the premier power in the whole world. It's good that Fred was able to say that, and not only say it, but to say it with pride and enthusiasm.
And associate with the Victorian age in everything he did. Nowhere can this be seen better than in his own house in Bolton. John Gawley was Fred's boiler inspector, and in the course of his work, he became a regular visitor to the house.
He was a great admirer of Victorian architecture, and he liked to look at it and talk to people about it. He was very good at that type of brickwork. Obviously, it's an extension of chimney repairing, but even his house, the extension to it, he got the bricks from demolished terraced houses that were in Bolton, of the same vintage as the rest of his house. And he did a lot of extra stonework on that house, which is quite beautiful to behold. So yes, he had quite an interest in architecture.
It's this that I like about the Victorian era, you know. That's why I've got so much of this sort of stuff here in my house, you know. I mean, this wonderful bit here came off the front of a shop somewhere, and you couldn't see it, of course, with the paint, the detail. So I boiled it up in caustic and all the paint come off, revealing all this lovely fancy work. And it's made of pots, actually, terracotta. And then, like, the wonderful age of Victorian gaslighting, like this magnificent thing here, you know, which the trouble that they went to, you know, and of course you can swing the thing about. Like, I wonder, you know, there must have been lots of gas leaks from all the various joints and taps. I mean, some of them I've seen were like 3 arms on, so you could more or less move the thing anywhere you wanted.
If you look at Fred's house, a lot of it, there was a lot of Victoriana about. He liked the old way of doing things. He was very much a perfectionist in everything that he did, and I think all of us that play with steam engines, we all live in the past a bit. But yeah, Fred, everything to do with sort of the Victorian era, he was interested in. It's all handmade by craftsmen, and nothing was machine made, and you know, that's why he liked it so much.
It is an age, the Victorian age, when engineers and mechanics were, you know, looked up to a bit. I think I'd like to have lived then, you know, when we made things like this. You know, the modern equivalent wouldn't be as beautiful as this. Can you imagine going to work every morning and you know, making these, you know, would have been quite a pleasurable do. I suppose they got a bit sick, but, you know, I think I'd sooner make these than hinges for car doors or something on that score, you know. You know, you don't even know which bloody car they're going on. There was something about it when, in the great age of steam, we led the world and made all the beautiful bits for these things.
I think he was very good on exactly that point, because although I think we do all now think it's a good thing we don't have an empire and go around the world telling everybody what to do, but the other side of that was a very great kind of generosity on the part of the Victorians, a great sense of civic pride, which Fred always brought out, whether he was looking at a town hall or a park, all those things the Victorians gave us, as well as town halls. He talked about mechanics institutes, but they gave us the swimming baths, the libraries, the public open spaces, all the things we're letting go again. And he was very good at emphasising that.
And Fred never missed an opportunity to show us the glories of the Victorian age. So, when he went to visit the Lloyd's building in London, he made sure he showed us the beautiful Victorian market next to it.
Yeah, right in the shadow of this great stainless steel and glass and concrete construction, there's a wonderful market, Victorian market, Leadenhall market, all made of cast iron and timber and what have you. You know, the Victorians went to great lengths to make things very beautiful as well as functional. The whole place is an iron founder's dream, you know, all the beautiful columns and the ornamental corbels and all the flowery bits will all be hollow. And inside, there'll be, behind, where nobody can see, there'll be big rectangular shaped holes, and then joining the ends together, there'll be millions of nuts and bolt holes, and the whole thing will be held together with nuts and bolts, you know. It's quite a wonderful thing, really, when you think about it. All these lovely wrought iron bars would once have had sides of beef hanging down and all of that sort of thing. It must have been an interesting place then, I rather think.
Oh, I think he would have done very well in the Victorian age. He had that absolutely Victorian mixture of being very keen on progress, very keen on getting things done, very keen on thinking through problems, and at the same time this complete fascination with the past and a great sympathy with the past. And the Victorians were always looking to the Middle Ages, building new buildings in a Gothic style, but as Fred showed, you know, all full of cast iron, all full of the latest technology. And I think his enthusiasm and his ingenuity, his way of thinking things through, would have made him a very successful Victorian.
Eastnor Castle in Herefordshire was built for the first Earl Somers in the first half of the 19th century. Its architect, Robert Smirke, designed it to look like a great medieval castle. When Fred visited it, he was able to show us this marriage of Gothic style and modern technology, as he raised the questions we all want to ask when we visit a great building like this.
How could they make the archways so big? How could they vault such a large cavernous space like this without using massive structural timbers?
I could think of several sort of television presenters who'd go and visit somewhere like Eastnor Castle because it's a large posh country house. But I think Fred's the only one I can think of who'd go and look in the roof space because it has some of the earliest large cast iron roof trusses, which are fantastically interesting because he's quite right, they're the most important thing about that house. But it would take Fred to see that, I think.
So Fred, this is the biggest cast iron beam we've got in the house. And this was fitted in 1818, just as the castle was being topped out. And you can imagine in a much older building there would have been a massive stone vault to support the superstructure. We do know who the people were who actually reckoned they did the job, Mr. Penn and Mr. Worth, the joiners. Well, it's amazing there's only two of them. They must have been fantastic men.
They'd be the ones who were literate, maybe. If they could write. There'd be a big army of labourers as well, you know.
Exactly.
Mr. Smirke made very clever use of cast iron, you know, not only in the structure or for structural purposes, but the ornamental side of it. I mean, if you look at this staircase, it looks as though it's made of wood, you know, but in actual fact, if you look more closely, you can see this that looks like carved wood is actually cast iron. And of course, the way that they would do this is to make, first of all, a wooden pattern and bury that in the sand in a moulding box and then pour in the molten iron. The great beam that we looked at up in the rafters would be made in exactly the same way, but on a much mightier scale. When you think about it, when you're having building work done, the plasterers and the tilers and the joiners are as important as the men who actually built the place. Once Eastnor Castle had been built, they proceeded with the interior work and it was all pretty lavish. This is the Gothic drawing room, which was redecorated in 1849. And for me, this is the height of Victorian splendour and embellishment. And it's a very fine example of how good they were at decorating places back in them days. The man responsible for the room was the architect and designer Augustus Welby Pugin.
I think the great impression you get from Fred's programmes is his enthusiasm. And that was a very strong Victorian idea, that if you put enough energy into something, if you really worked hard at it, if you really loved it, then you would succeed. And I think that there's a great sense nowadays that, you know, you can do things without a lot of effort. And he knew that it did take effort to produce these amazing machines and buildings that he loved so much. What Fred tells us about Pugin is not just to look at the outside of the building, but to look on the inside of the building, and that it's a complete design space. Pugin was having to deal with very new technologies in many ways. You know, how do you make a gas fitting? How do you make a whole suite of tables, for example? You need 100 tables, all in different designs. How do you deal with these design problems, but yet keep them within a consistent style? So he's asking questions all the time about how do you apply style to function. And I think this is the key to Victorian architecture, that it's not just about the ornament on the outside, it's about what holds it up and what is it used for.
Nowhere can this be seen better than at one of our greatest monuments to the Victorian age, Tower Bridge.
Inside that great castle-like exterior, there's a great big steel frame that were constructed by the same men who built the Forth Bridge. It took 8 years to build, and 5 different major contracting companies, and the relentless labour of 500 men. And there's about 11,000 tons of steel in the towers and the walkways and the roadways. On the completion of the steelwork, it was clad in Cornish granite and Portland stone, both to protect the ironwork and give it the beautiful appearance that it has now. Yeah, when you come inside one of the towers, you know, you can see its great steel skeleton, you know, that's all riveted together. The whole thing would stand up really without the fancy stonework or the beautification on the outside, you know. It's a wonderful bit of ironwork, really, you know. Let's do some riveting, you know.
Fred was very good at looking at things which were very famous. I mean, you could look at Tower Bridge and make you feel you'd never seen it before. And people have heard of Pugin, they've all heard of the Palace of Westminster, and he showed us the House of Lords and all of that. But I think for most people, Pugin is just a name associated with some very expensive wallpaper recently. But because he went off and he looked at Eastnor Castle, he looked at St Giles Cheadle. St Giles Cheadle is a wonderful church, but it's in quite a small town in Staffordshire, and I think a lot of people don't realise that they might have a world-class work of art in their own town, just round the corner, 20 minutes drive away. And I think that kind of programme makes people feel that, yeah, they can go and see these things.
Pugin called St Giles his gem, the finest church he ever designed. And I'm inclined to agree with him in some ways, you know, because he's really gone to town with the fancy work, you know, but there's something about artists and designers like him. You know, you can't get away from the same squiddly bits that keep cropping up everywhere, in House of Commons, Eastnor Castle, everywhere, you know, these beautiful tiles. Even the same designs transferred over into the central heating grating, you know. And when you look behind me here, this lovely screen and its pan vaulting reminds me of the wood holding the lantern up at Ely Cathedral. And sort of all everywhere there's all this wonderful Gothic ornamentation. Even up on the roof, you know, like the ridge tiles are made of cast iron, and they're almost identical to the ones on the Houses of Parliament. It's as though he's constantly going back to the Middle Ages.
I'm always astonished at the way in which he moves from the very grand scale of buildings or engineering projects right down to the small scale of the details of the decoration. And what he shows us is that these are all part of the same system that the Victorians had set up. So they were interested in getting things to work wonderfully, smoothly, but they also wanted them to be beautiful. And I think Fred shows us through a number of things that he's got in his own collection. Something like a lavatory cistern bracket. You know, that's a small scale object. It's nothing fancy, but it's something that somebody took some care about.
Even these humble brackets, you know, started life off holding the cistern up in a toilet, you know, in the spinning mill. And I just remember there's another pair there. I think I'll go back for them because
They're rather elegant, aren't they? Beautifully made, you know, cast iron. They don't seem nowadays, reproduction cast iron never seems as nice and fine as when the Victorians did it.
And it's this idea of wanting to put effort again into what you're making, what you're doing, making it special, making it individual, making it personal. And I think that is the key to both to the Victorians in many ways, but also to how Fred talks to us.
And what he related to best was the sort of small-scale domestic architecture, like all the Victorian features here in the houses at Beamish Open Air Museum.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Rather a splendid parlour you've got here, eh?
It's very nice.
Yeah, it's like a bit of a cut above the others, isn't it? With the semicircular arches and the... I've got a fireplace like that at home in one of my bedrooms.
Oh, you're lucky.
Yeah, it's about 1850, I would think, that thing were made. Yeah. And all, and the lovely sash windows with the panelling and the shutters and everything. This is quite posh, isn't it?
Yes, this
it's,
is
a bit,
rather superior residence.
Yeah. I'll see, there's not even any gas lamps, is there? It's only like oil lamps, still on the oil, you know.
No, they're
and
a bit old-fashioned we are.
Splendid ceiling rows there, that's, yeah, very beautiful. Mm. Yeah, my mother wanted me to learn to play the piano, but I never got around to going. Yeah, my brother went, and the pianoforte teacher used to say to me, "Why don't you come instead? You'd be better at it than he is." Good morning. This is a bit like home from home for me, this. Like, really, the Victorian cast iron fire grate is like the centre of the household, you know. Everything happened here. The bread were baked and all the boiling water come out and it dried all the clothes on the rail here. It's quite a fascinating thing.
It was Victorian through and through, Fred, and he had certain ideas that he'd expect his wife to behave and respond. Say, for instance, if his meal wasn't on the table at a certain time, he'd be quite cross, or you know, he might expect that you should have the house spotless and even bake bread. But of course, there's only so many hours in a day that you can do, and he'd go out and moan to people that, "Whoa, you know, I'm not having bloody tea yet." Like,
do you do this often, dear?
Once a week.
Once a week. Yeah, I've actually got one at home that's a bit older than this, and I mastered a way of doing the black leading with an electric drill, you know, with a mop on the end, you know, makes life a bit easier. It's quite a technical one, this, isn't it? It's got all these lovely, are these for working the dampers and things?
Yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting, yeah. Oh, Mr. Moffat Brothers, eh? Gateshead.
Yes, it's a local
Gateshead on Tyne. Yeah, you've got quite a few labour-saving devices in here, haven't you? That's for cleaning knives, isn't it?
Yes, because there was
I've
steel
got one, but it's not in as good a nick as yours.
I remember him talking about how you could see the letters Co-op on any high street at one point in the 19th century. And I think that's the kind of thing a lot of people will have seen on their own high street and walked past it a million times. And then when you've seen Fred's programme, you walk past it and you think, oh, right, that's what he was talking about. He made sense, I think, of a lot of the built environment that people have got very used to.
The original co-op business started off in Rochdale in 1844. It sort of mushroomed into an England-wide organisation that in the end they had their own architects and their own builders and the beautiful structures that they did. You know, they always stood out in, like in Lancashire, in a poor mill neighbourhood, you know, there were always this beautiful building, the co-op, and they always had a beautiful plaque on, you know, the Farmworth and Kersley Cooperative Society or the Bolton Cooperative Society, and of course it went on and on until it got that big. I don't think they could manage it. And of course the architecture, these lovely, they were like wood inside of a big wooden box. They were all the same with lovely T&G board in with lovely beadings down the edge. Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, this is the co-op. It reminds me of when I was little, all this lot in here, you know, when I used to go to the co-op in just round the corner from where we lived. There's only one difference. There's some white cloth bags hanging out of the ceiling. What the flour come down. They've got same thing here, but it's in a tin box in the corner, I've noticed. And all. They even had one of these for cutting black twist in half, like a guillotine, you know. Health and safety job, I don't know what they'd say about that. Ah. Now then, Malcolm, I know what you're doing, but these lot at the other end of here don't, do they? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to send the money by using a system which will take the ball and lift it up onto the track, which will then be forced down by gravity, and it runs into the cash office.
There was a similar contraption to this in the Co-op in Bolton when I was a little lad, but it worked off either a vacuum or a compressed air. But it did exactly the same thing, you know. It made life a lot easier for the guy behind the counter, you know. Here you've got all sorts of interesting stuff in here. You cater for the mining men as well, didn't you?
Yes, we have our miners' shovels.
Yeah, big
also, we have the picks. The men had to buy their own equipment.
They were on good wages then, contrary to what a lot of people think.
Yes,
you know,
it's a little bit different.
Yeah. It was a funny occupation, really. It varied so much, didn't it, depending on the price of coal and who would fall
in this area, it was all mines, and coal was actually king at the time. So it was depending on how much the coal was selling for, miners would get paid.
He looked at Victorian, gold watch chain, waistcoat and so on. But also in his views of the world, he believed in the worth ethic. He believed that money should only be made by hard labour, basically. And he wasn't too keen on the way money is made these days, which is not always directly through work.
His contribution to how we lived, I think, was a particular understanding of how the industrial working classes lived and what was expected of them, because he was just old enough to have heard old people talking about the age before the welfare state, the age before a real caring about housing quality. And I think in his odd little asides, he's making clear that the good old days weren't always good, but they were heroic.
At Beamish, they've recreated a complete pit village with the winding engine, the headgear, the washeries, the engine sheds, the village school, the Methodist chapel, that means no drinking. Last but not least, a beautiful row of cottages, pitmen's cottages, just like they used to be. Considering like this is a pitman's cottage, you know, it's very small, but they've made very good use of the space, you know, sort of thing. I mean, that in there's the parlour with the beautiful elliptical table. And of course, just round corner, there's a double bed, you know. You have to be ill before you move the bed into the parlour in Lancashire, but it must have been common round here. It's the bed and the parlour all in the same thing. And of course, I think the kids were upstairs, you know, up in the roof space. And in here, this is the kitchen, and this is Denise, who's doing this wonderful peg rug.
Well, a peg rug to you, but a proggy mat to us.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember my mum doing things like that after the war, you know, when times were hard. Yeah. That, of course, is the fireplace with the oven. And that round oven is particularly noted for its locality. You know, you only ever see them in northeast of England, never anywhere else. Everywhere else, they're all square or rectangular shaped. I know I've got one somewhat similar, with same sort of handle, but a square door.
A lot of people still use the word Victorian as a term of abuse. It's pejorative. You know, we blame the Victorians for so many of society's ills today. You know, the way we live in our cities, the things that we've done to our countryside, the way that our factory systems work. We seem to think that the Victorians should have been more far-sighted. They should have been more politically correct, I suppose. And I think that Fred, by drawing attention to their great achievements, makes us realise that it wasn't all dark satanic mills. I do think that though there can sometimes be a problem in the programmes, that it is very celebratory of the past and very subjective in the way that he talks about the past. And I think that there are times when you look at a worker's cottage in Beamish and it's all spick and span, and you think, well, actually, what would it be like when somebody comes back from the coal mine and they're still grubby and they've got 6 kids and they've got to feed them, and you know, you do slightly wonder whether it is a bit rose tinted, and that the reality of of working in a mine or working in a factory, even though you are surrounded by beautiful machinery, which is all highly decorated, it might have been rather less pleasant than some of the programmes give you the idea about.
He didn't want to preserve the fact that folks were living on a pittance and, you know, in houses with no modern facilities. It wasn't that he wanted to preserve. It was just purely the craftsman's side of the job, the way things were designed and built.
Fred shows his love of the Victorian age a great deal through his appreciation of what he could see. He looked at pumping engines being a thing of great beauty, for example, in water supply. And you can look at the aesthetics of a piece of Victorian engineering when things were made where form and function went hand in hand, whereas now we're very much a sort of throwaway society where something is made to do a job here and now and not much thought is gone towards what it looks like. The Victorians had that sense of aesthetics, and I think that appealed to Fred a great deal, and he was able to show the public through his programmes that appeal as well, to see that, you know, these things didn't only look well, they performed well, and they lasted a very long time.
I wonder if they'll let us have a go at, you know, playing with the handles. I suppose you'd think that I'm here to actually knock this thing down, but this is not the case, you know. We're here actually to restore it, and we've fitted round it 16 new iron bands to help preserve our industrial heritage.
Fred was best known for felling chimneys, but that was the job he liked least. His real interest was in restoring them and keeping them standing. And it was this work and the places it took him to that had the biggest influence on him.
I think Fred, when he had to knock down a chimney, was very upset because, of course, he started off as a young man, as a very young boy, watching the steeplejacks climbing the big chimneys and repairing them. And when it came full circle and time to demolish them, he was very sad. I know he confided in me many, many occasions where we'd get the old photographs out and look, and he'd study them and think, well, that's no longer there. I remember a time on the Bolton skyline when you could see dozens and dozens of these big things, and it was a great sadness in Fred that he had to demolish so many chimneys, really.
I think in his job as a steeplejack, in moving around all these factories and so on, he would see the beauty of Victorian work. First of all, the chimneys themselves, the brickwork on those was, outstanding. And he would note that first of all, and no doubt, since chimneys are attached to boiler houses, he would walk around the associated boiler houses and look at the workmanship in there. And I suppose he'd start with the brickwork, which wasn't just ordinary kind of house brickwork, it was very good brickwork and had a very good finish on it and was quite artistic.
Fred lived through an age in which we started off by knocking down a large part of the Victorian heritage and then grew to value it. And he was obviously engaged on both sides of the argument because he was involved with knocking down the great chimneys of the mills. At the same time, he was involved with lovingly restoring steam machinery, bringing it to a wider public.
One of the restoration projects that he took on was here at Wetherick's Country Pottery in Cumbria.
This weird and wonderful creation behind me is what's known as a blunger. And about 5 years ago, I came here to look at the steam engine and the boiler,
And this creation were like, had willow herbs growing out at the top of it, and it were in great danger of disappearing into the ground forever. And we got the job of restoring it, and more or less it's practically a brand new one. You know, there's only the gearing and the bearings and some of the ironwork is original. Across the other side of the road there were a big clay pit, and they dug the clay out of the pit and brought it up the hill on a railway and tipped it into this ginormous Kenwood chef cake mixer and added water, and the water and the machinery mixed all the clay up, and all the pebbles fell to the bottom. And then when it became the consistency of Earl milk chocolate, they flooded it off down a trough and into a lagoon over there, and then they pumped the water off the top back to another pond which is situated to the side of the site. And when it had set nice and hard, they cut it out in blocks and made the pots out of it. And like we've now restored it to working order, and of course it's driven by the steam engine, which is in this engine house over here. This is Josephine, you know, this is the engine that drives the plunger outside. And it took me and my assistant about 6 months, 7 months to restore it. You know, we pulled the thing to bits and charted it back to Bolton and restored it all and brought it back here. And here it is now, driving all the machinery in the Cotswolds.
This passion for preserving the past came over in everything that Fred did.
I think Fred was very important in making us aware of the heritage around us, not just in the great town halls and the great railway stations, but actually in the small-scale domestic architecture and artefacts. I mean, I think about the sort of things that he was collecting himself, pieces of shop fronts which were going to decay and had been painted over and nobody took any care of anymore, and he rescued them and showed us that these things are all around us. Little engines that would end up on a scrap heap, but were part of our industrial heritage.
All of these engines were lovingly restored by Fred, but the restoration projects he is best remembered for are his steamroller and his traction engine.
After 27 years and 2 divorces and a lot of hard graft, we've only got £100 on, but we're going to give it a go and see what happens. I know it'll go round, but it's what it'll sound like's the important thing. So this is it, here we go. Handle forward, regulator open. Nothing happened. Wait a minute. We're going backwards at present. We'll try it forwards. Magic. All them years and never knowing really whether we were ever going to make it or not. When you think we nearly made a new one. And all. We have made a new one. Yeah.
A lot of people that he was with at the steam runners, etc., of course they're all just the same. They're all people that are born out of their time because they all wish to preserve the things that they do. And it's not so important the fact that, you know, why they've saved something. It's just as important the fact that they have.
Aha! Good Lord! Who gave you a passport to come here? How are you?
I don't come so often. It's
a long time no see, Fred.
Years.
It is indeed. Absolutely. Good to see you. I'm well, and you?
And it was thanks to Fred that the efforts of enthusiasts like this were brought to our attention.
Here in this building, there's a dedicated bunch of ladies and gentlemen who have been restoring mill engines for the last 30 odd years. And I think I'll nip inside and see how they're doing.
Hello, Fred. Fancy meeting you.
Ah, well, I know I get about a bit, you know. The last time I saw this, it were in 1,000,000 pieces. You're doing quite well now with it.
I haven't counted them, but it seems like 1,000,000 at times.
Yeah, it's looking pretty good, isn't it? Almost ready for, once you put all the bits and various rods on.
Yep, it's nearly finished.
It should be able to light a fire underneath it.
It's been on the shop floor for the last 30 years about. But we've been working on it at this level now for about 2 years.
Yeah, it don't seem to be very far off, it looks like.
We're getting near the end.
Yeah, all the hard work's been done, hasn't it?
It has, it certainly has.
How heavy's this beam?
Well, that's a rough guess, about 7 tons, I should think.
Yeah, it's a fair piece of iron, isn't it?
That's what I call a real work of art, that, Fred. There's more went into the skill of making this than Picasso ever put into one of the expensive paintings.
Yeah, that's a fact, yeah.
That's my humble opinion.
Well, you were drunk half the time, weren't you?
Yeah, well, I suppose some of the blokes that put this up were drunk half the time.
More than likely, yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing it running, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I bet you. Yeah.
I didn't think I'd live to see that, but looks like I'm going to do.
He was in at a time when the sort of first generation of industry and old machinery enthusiasts were about, when people were just beginning to get the idea of rescuing traction engines from scrapyards and sort of raising historic boats and repairing them.
Yeah. I couldn't really think of a nicer place to restore a paddle boat on than here on the bonny banks of Loch Lomond. I think I'll go and have a chat with the lads who are doing it. They've got a big hard task in front of them.
He was in right at the beginning of that, and I think that and those wide-eyed loonies will have influenced him, because he's one of them.
Ding ding! Michael. You've got your work cut out there, haven't you, mate?
Yes, a lot of work here.
I see you've done the other one on the other side.
Yes, that took a few days.
Yeah, I bet it did. I know I've got one of them, and progress is very slow, but when you've done it, it gets out. It's amazing what thickness of corrosion it bangs loose, isn't it?
Well, they've been putting layers of paint on since 1953, probably.
And just flicking a bit off when they did it, Really wasting paint doing it that way, isn't it?
It is,
You're better off getting it down to bottom. How long have you had it like? How sort of,
Well, we came along about 5 years ago, and it was a very sorry state indeed.
Yeah, I can imagine,
She was very derelict and rusty.
Yeah.
And had been lying for a number of years in that state.
Yeah.
So we've been coming down every Saturday for the last 5 years. And
How many of a team have you got?
It varies from 5 to 12, 15 maybe.
On enthusiasm on the day?
On a good day,
Fred's programmes have helped everybody to understand exactly what preserving the heritage is all about and why it's so important to us.
And it wasn't just ships and engines and big machines that he wanted to see preserved.
He champions more ordinary buildings. We all know about great palaces and cathedrals and so on, but Fred talks about ordinary industrial buildings as well, and where people lived and where people worked. And that's just as important part of our social history.
One of the great things that Fred did for us was to show us the variety of places in Britain that need to be preserved for future generations. And there's one way in which we can all get involved, and he shows how volunteers, just members of the public, maybe with special skills, or maybe people who are just enthusiastic, can get involved. Somewhere like Cold Harbour Mill, which is full of volunteers who are all hugely involved in preserving and maintaining that place so that we can all enjoy it.
Now then, John, you won't hit it too hard. It's a bit moppy, isn't it?
It's a bit. I've had the money's worth out of this one.
Yeah, they have. Oh, yeah. It must have been a bit on the tight side with all these patches. How long do you think it'll be before you've got the going again?
Well, it's about a 2-year project.
Yeah. You got somebody give you some nice sheets of tin, have you? For the
The local engineering firm have been very good to us.
Yeah, well, that's all right, Shall we go and have a look at your beam engine?
What a good idea.
Yeah, come on. This is it, is it then? This is the thing that replaced the water wheel.
It certainly did. Yes, in the mid-19th century, they brought in steam power. This is where the first beam engine sat. And was more reliable, of course, than water power.
Yeah, especially when they'd had an hot summer and there was no water in the pond. Yeah, it's an interesting engine, this, isn't it? There's a lot of unusual
bits and bobs about it. I mean, this linkage from here to the stop valve, you know, I mean, it's magnificent, isn't it? Like, yeah, who needs a gym when you've got them sort of things?
Well, there you go. It's all heavy stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, it takes us a day to warm up.
Yeah.
Warm the boiler up
with the
before
boiler,
a steamer.
Yeah.
And because, of course, we've got 2 big engines to run as well.
Yeah.
So let's go
No,
and have a look at the other big
bit
engine.
more modern, isn't it? More the turn of the century job.
That's right. When the beam engine was scrapped here, the other engine was fitted.
Yeah. We'll go and have a look at the other one.
Good idea.
Go and have a look. No, but I've been inside it.
Fred had a particular interest in the preservation of our industrial heritage, but in his programmes he looked at much wider conservation issues.
Bath time.
Fred's big contribution in terms of issues and standards and values with conservation is he's highlighted technology. There's a tendency for people to highlight the appearance of things rather than the way that things are put together and what they're made of and how they work. And I think Fred's way of looking at a medieval structure is a very refreshing way of doing it.
This is the church of the Hospital of St Cross, and building started in 1135. And this is the only major bit that survived. When it was first built, it had a thatch roof, but sometime in the 14th century it acquired the lead one. Now around the other side they're actually taking part of it off, so we'll be able to go and see how the Normans put a roof on a church like this one.
He's looking at it saying, how did they put these particular timbers together? What order was it done in? How are the loads transmitted? All of that sort of thing. How do they get those pegs in there? You know, how are they going to maintain this thing? A practical view. And we don't often hear that about old things. We hear about sort of flowerings of the human spirit on a grand scale, but we don't very often hear the detail of how it's made and of how it's maintained. And I think that sort of practicality really strikes a chord with a lot of people and is one of the reasons why he was such a great man.
Morning, Fred.
Hello, Stuart. I've come having to see what you're doing in your tent up here. To have a look how the Normans built big, thick walls.
Or not so thick.
Yeah. It's a bit... what were down the middle there, like?
Well, when we started work here, this was concrete.
Yeah.
Concrete was put in by the Victorians.
Oh, yeah.
It originally had a wooden gutter all the way through here, clad in lead.
Yeah.
And when that rotted away with age, the Victorians had just discovered concrete and decided to pour the whole gutter in concrete and then cover it in lead. But what happened was the concrete acted like a wick. Where it touched the wall, it drew all the moisture in. That travelled right through the concrete. Yeah. And you can see what it's done here.
Yeah.
It's eaten the wood away. The Death Watch beetle have made a meal of it. They like soft timber, and that's what they've chosen to eat first.
Yeah, you can see how it's kecking over, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. The spread of the roof is slowly rolling this, and these joints at one time would have been tight.
Yeah. Have you seen any of these deadly Death Watch
Yes,
beetles?
we have. Yes, we had a grub yesterday.
Yeah.
But we decided it had already done enough damage, and I'm afraid I squashed it.
Fred was a very good communicator and very good at explaining how buildings worked and how they actually stood up in the first place. And of course, if buildings can't stand up, there's no point in having them. And if people can understand how buildings were put together in the past, it can be a guide to how they can be repaired in the future, and also help people really appreciate what's going on with their buildings.
See, you've got a dustbin full of
yes.
building materials.
Yeah. This is our flints. I mean, the great thing about this is that they're the originals.
Yeah, they're quite heavy stuff, isn't it?
It is, yes. A lot of weight in that.
Yeah.
We'll lose a percentage here.
Oh, yeah.
But we can replace them off the fields.
Yeah,
just the way they did in the first place.
Go out with a bucket.
Absolutely.
Tied on your back.
Ah, yes. Times have changed. Farmers used to be glad for us to take them.
Yeah.
Now they want money for it.
They're all loud up, aren't they? The outside of the vaulting looks a bit rough, but of course inside it's lovely.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, this line here that you can see, these stones, you can actually see those inside. And you'll see that really sort of shows us how thick the vaulting is. Because inside you'll see that this is right at the top of the piece you can see.
Yeah, so it's
and
like
so
about,
this is all
about
on top of
14 or 15 inches thick.
Yes. I mean, the vaulting is basically an arch, and an arch only works if it's got a weight on it. So all this has just been put on top to add strength
together.
to it.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, really, when you think they had no cement mixers, there must have been armies of blokes mixing the mortar to keep the wall.
I mean, we're
going.
50, 60 feet up here, so all that's been carried up here.
Yeah.
Tons and tons of it. We've no idea what the actual weight is.
Sand and lime, eh?
Yes.
As soon as you show the general public a really skilled craftsman doing what they do, most people are immediately fascinated and engaged by it. And, you know, naturally unrespectful of it. You know, great craft skills, and there are sadly few of them in a lot of craft areas. So I thought it was terrific that Fred actually first wanted to get his hands dirty himself, partly to show, in a way which conveys how difficult this is, and also to celebrate the skills of people like, you know, stonemasons, tile makers, of plasterers. I mean, those are extraordinary levels of skill, which today have largely been short-circuited by industrial manufacture of building materials, by use of plasterboard instead, and a lot of those skills are barely kept alive, and it needs publicity to remind people that they're there, and to pay tribute to them, not least because we really need them to keep our historic buildings standing.
He was very good at seeing what was going on. He very often dealt with topical things, like the conservation at Ightham Moat, for example, actually looking at the way the walls had been constructed originally and how trouble was being taken to do them in the original way so that it was genuine conservation. And so often he would take an example. He'd always want to have a go himself, which was very important.
Right, this is where we mix, Fred. As you can see, we've already got the
all the most modern machinery.
And the shovel, which if you put these gloves on, I'll show you.
You want me to go in the go muck?
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Bit surgical, these, aren't they? No, it's approximately half of that full of.
That is the sifted cow dung.
Yeah, it's
fresh
nice
cow
stuff,
dung.
is it?
That's it.
Yeah, wait a minute.
You got it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And you can tell.
A nice measure. Yeah. Oh, good. That's rich, isn't it?
I was collecting this 7 o'clock this morning.
Yeah, so it's fresh.
With our local dairy herd.
Yeah. I've never been into rubber gloves here. How do you get that one off? Here's Paul.
Yeah, you're going to enjoy your toasting.
Oh, it's all right. I'm used to pretty rough things, you know. Hey. I'll tell you what, it takes a bit of mixing, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it isn't sort of easy to shove about.
Just turn it over, that's it. You've got it.
Yeah. It's changing colour slowly. Looking good, eh?
I think you're almost there, Fred. Yeah.
What's the idea of the cow dung like?
Right, well, it does give it more elasticity, you know, with when you're spreading it. It also hardens.
Yeah.
Acts
I
as a
wonder who
harden.
first invented it. Who first?
Yeah, well, obviously before the lime and that, it was wattle, and that was cow and horse straw and dung, wasn't it? So they've used it for, but it's an adhesion as well, you know. It's
the type of cow matters, does it?
That's right. I would say he's done that before myself.
Oh, I mixed a bit of mortar in my time.
Have you? Yeah.
Never with any cow muck in it.
See how you get on with that.
I'll have a go.
Have a go.
Right. Do you want me to continue in a downwards direction?
Yeah, it'd be nice.
Oh, bloody hell.
Let me put less on the hook, perhaps.
Yeah.
That's it. Push it well in, because it has to go through the lave to key.
Yeah, wait a minute.
That's all right, come on.
He could turn his hand to anything. You mention it and he'd do a very good job, no matter what it was.
Now that's going to be there 800 years.
Yeah.
It's good to think that we do something that's going to stand the test of time, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, I think that's enough for me.
That's great. Any time you want a job with me.
Yeah, it does have a tendency to stick to the float, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's all. When you think how well it sticks to the float, it must stick to the like the proverbial what's it to the blanket.
Well, that's right.
A lot of people who look at half timbered houses don't really know that all this goes on.
It's quite a job, really. At least it's going back as it was, and that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah.
It's
yeah, it'll be lovely when it's done, won't it?
And Fred had plenty of experience at restoring an old building.
When I bought this house about 40 years ago, it basically were a 2 up and 2 down. And of course, as my family got bigger, I got to do something about it. So I built as much on it again, all the wonderful buildings we've been looking at, even castles and all that. They've all been messed about with and extended one way and another, Even kings were great DIY men. There've been extensions done to the house in the days of the Earl of Bradford, but they didn't make a very good job of it, They completely omitted all the beading and the fancy work. But when I did mine, I thought I'll try and reproduce what they did in 1854. When I first did the moulding and the fancy bits, the little square pieces were sort of very white material, and they stood out like a sore thumb. So I made a mixture of mud and water out of the back garden and painted them, and of course God and the rain has done the rest. They're now quite a good match with the moulding.
But Fred's way of restoring things and making the new work blend in with the old doesn't fit in with current conservation policy, as he found out in Edinburgh.
This magnificent monument here on Princess Street in Edinburgh was erected in remembrance of Sir Walter Scott, the famous Scottish writer. Recently there's been quite a lot of restoration work done on it, and they've used exactly the same stone, but of course it'll never get as black as what the rest of it is, because there won't be the same amount of smoke in Edinburgh as there used to be. The thing is that I rather think that if I'd have done it, I'd have daubed a bit of mud on it, make it blend in with the other. But apparently the powers that be say it's because the future generations will be able to see where the late 20th century repairs were actually done to it, you see, in the future years to come.
Well, that's the official policy, but Fred's way would be more likely to win the popular vote.
When you're talking about saving Britain's heritage and bringing it to people's attention, I don't think anybody did as much as Fred in popularising it, bringing it down to a level where everybody could understand it and wanted to get involved.
And he brought to our attention examples of preservation work in some of the most surprising places, like here in the Lloyd's building in London.
I thought I might show you something a little bit different. So if you like to come in here.
Wow.
Well, this, Fred, is something of a contrast. This is a genuine. This is a genuine Robert Adam dining room. The reason it's here is that when we had virtually completed the 1958 building, which is on the other side of Lime Street, we found that part of Bowood House in Wiltshire, which belonged to the Marquis of Lansdowne, was being demolished, and this room was due to be destroyed. So Lloyd's collectively purchased the room. We also found that, happily, the original firm responsible for creating the room under Adam's direction was still in existence. So we commissioned them again, and the whole room was cut into sections, brought to the city and recreated in the 1958 building. Well, of course, if you've done that once, there's no reason why you can't do it again. That's right. So when we moved from 58 to 86, the room came with us. And the great thing about the room as you see it now is that it's actually gone back to its original proportions. In the 1958 building, because of a height restriction, it had a flat ceiling. But here, if Robert Adam walked through the room, we like to think that he would recognise it.
One of the things I liked about Fred's programmes were the moments when he'd suddenly say, I've got one of those at home, and you'd think, how amazing. But of course he had, and quite, in some ways, quite ordinary things. What he had a bit of wood carving off the front of a house, and he'd restored it and he'd done it up, and he would talk about it and stroke it and make you look at it more carefully. And he was very good at making you see the special in very ordinary things.
Believe it or not, you know, I've been looking around while we've been talking, and that Cornish moulding up there, across the end of my back kitchen, I've got a piece almost exactly the same.
I didn't know Robert Adam was a kitchen designer.
Well,
Fred.
no, I know he had nothing to do with it, you know. You can buy anything nowadays in shops.